The Regency era was a time of elegance, refinement, and very poor decisions when it came to staying alive through clothing. If you were lucky enough to snag an invitation to a Regency ball, congratulations, your reward is frostbite, respiratory infections, and possibly slow poisoning via your wardrobe. Because in this glorious age of style, fashion didn't just cost money, it cost your dignity, your body temperature, and occasionally your pulse. Hello travelers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why you wouldn't survive one night at a Regency ball, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the ladies. Regency women were dressed not to end, but to be ended by what they were wearing. The dominant fashion was inspired by neoclassicism, which meant looking like a Greco-Roman statue brought awkwardly to life. The silhouette? High-waisted, slim-fitting gowns that began just below the bust and floated down in a straight line. Sounds simple enough, until you realize the gowns were made of muslin, a fabric so thin you could read War and Peace through it, and not just the title page, the whole thing. Muslin was prized for its draping quality, which is fashion speak for it clings to your every contour and reveals whether or not you had pudding for lunch. This meant that underclothes, shifts, stays, and petticoats were worn strategically, if at all. Some daring souls even dampened their gowns before entering the ballroom to ensure maximum clinging and minimum shame. Wet t-shirt contests, Regency edition, and what season was the peak of the social calendar? Winter, of course, because nothing says glamour like gliding into a marble ballroom in January in a dress made of cold mist. Cloaks and shawls were briefly donned en route, but once inside it was all goosebumps and good posture. There were no heaters, no central heating, and certainly no understanding of respiratory health. If you didn't shiver through a ball while pretending not to cough up your lungs, were you even fashionable? Now let's talk about corsets. Contrary to Victorian mythology, Regency corsets, often called stays, weren't meant to crush your ribcage into a wasp. They were a bit kinder, just stiff enough to lift and separate without entirely collapsing your lungs. But that's only if you had them properly fitted, which was rarely the case. One size did not fit all, but it was often made to anyway. Some ladies found themselves compressed into shapes that would make a geometry teacher weep. Makeup didn't exactly improve your odds of survival either. While excessive face paint was considered déclassé after the excesses of the 18th century, many still dabbled. A touch of rouge? Lovely. A little powder? Why not? That powder containing lead? Oh well, that's fashion, darling. Some women also followed the dangerous trend of painting their dresses with arsenic-based green dyes, so you might look ravishing, but only until the rashes, hair loss, or hallucinations set in. Hair was another battlefield. The goal? Sculpted updos that looked effortless but required hours of labor, dozens of pins, and often the assistance of a small team. Women curled their hair with heated irons. Fire hazard, anyone? Or plastered it with concoctions so sticky you could catch flies with your head. Some even added false hair from other people, sometimes from horses, always unsettling. Men didn't get off easy either. The dashing Mr. Darcy look didn't come without pain. Tailcoats were so tight they had to be wriggled into with the determination of someone squeezing into a wetsuit that's 2 sizes too small. The fashion ideal was for a man's figure to form a perfect hourglass. Broad shoulders, cinched waist, athletic calves, all achieved through tailoring, padding, and sometimes corsetry of their own. Yes, gentlemen wore corsets too. Nothing says masculinity like gasping quietly between quadrilles. Their shirts, frilly and starched to the stiffness of origami, made movement stiff and conversations stiffer. Cravats, the elaborate neckcloths tied into complicated knots, could take an hour to get right. Entire books were published with diagrams on how to fold your neckwear to perfection. One wrong fold and suddenly you weren't a refined gentleman, you were a neck napkin peasant. And don't forget the shoes, slippers to be exact. dainty things made of soft leather or silk with soles thinner than Regency morals. They offered zero support and even less traction. Combine that with highly polished ballroom floors and you had the Regency equivalent of ice skating. Many a gentleman's pride and many a lady's modesty were lost in tragic slipping incidents that would today be accompanied by cartoon sound effects. So why did people go along with it? Because to survive socially, you had to risk not surviving physically. A fashionable appearance could mean the difference between securing a good marriage or becoming the scandal of the season. Better a collapsed lung than a collapsed reputation. In conclusion, if your dress didn't give you pneumonia, your corset didn't mangle your torso, or your makeup didn't quietly poison you, then perhaps your shoes would simply betray you at the top of a marble staircase. Either way, Regency fashion was less about expressing yourself and more about surviving the expectations of everyone else. And let's be honest, if you made it through the night looking glamorous and only mildly hypothermic, that was the victory. Let's get one thing straight. If you think simply wanting to attend a Regency ball meant you could, then you have woefully underestimated the British aristocracy's ability to make everything exclusive, exhausting and judgmental. In Regency England, receiving an invitation to a ball wasn't just a social nicety. It was the Olympics of nepotism. And unless your bloodline had been steeping in powdered wig society for generations, you weren't getting in, not even with a smile, a bribe, or the emotional desperation of a Jane Austen heroine on a deadline. The Regency social world was run by a group known as the Ton, short for le bon ton, meaning good manners, or more realistically, we decide who matters. The Ton was less a community, and more a tight-knit cartel of dukes, earls, baronets and women named things like Lady Snortling Pym or Viscountess Featherstone Haw, pronounced Fanshawe just to hurt you. These people didn't just attend society, they curated it. If they didn't know your name, they certainly didn't want to learn it. And if they did know your name and found it distasteful, congratulations, you were now socially radioactive, to be considered in society, and therefore eligible to attend the endless carousel of balls, soirees, dinners, and thinly disguised marriage markets. You had to be presented. Specifically, you needed to be introduced at court. This was the glittery, crushing ritual where a young lady, known as a debutante, was paraded in front of the monarch and a room full of titled strangers while wearing enough tulle and terror to fuel a minor breakdown. Once you'd curtsied to royalty and survived the gaze of Queen Charlotte, or later the Prince Regent's withering indifference, you were considered an official member of the social season. But here's the catch. You didn't just show up to court. Someone had to sponsor you. Typically a noblewoman of impeccable standing, with just the right amount of boredom and arrogance. Your sponsor vouched that you weren't a disaster, socially, morally, or fashionably, and if you were, it would be a stain on her reputation. So let's just say she chose carefully. If your mother had a scandal in 1794, or your father's fortune came from trade, i.e. actual work, your odds of finding a willing sponsor were lower than a footman's paycheck, and getting into society didn't mean you were liked in society. There was a dizzying hierarchy within the hierarchy. Dukes outranked marquesses, who outranked earls, who outranked viscounts, who outranked barons, who all outranked you. And each level came with its own invisible seating chart, dance card, and bathroom access. Metaphorically speaking, this was still an era of chamber pots. You couldn't just mingle freely. There were rules, and if you broke them, you wouldn't be scolded, you'd be socially evaporated. Now let's talk about invitations. Getting one wasn't just about being on a list, it was about being on the right list. Hosts, usually ambitious society women clawing their way towards status or already perched smugly at the top, sent out handwritten, sealed in wax invitations to those they deemed worthy. Worthiness was determined by your family name, your fortune, your connections, and whether Lady Bramblethorpe once saw your aunt curtsy adequately at the theatre in 1802. This wasn't a meritocracy, it was an aristocracy, and it played by its own labyrinthine rules. For example, your invitation could be revoked if a relative embarrassed themselves at last week's musical evening. or if a different hostess saw you at the wrong venue with the wrong people. Social guilt was transferable, and reputations had a half-life shorter than Regency dental care. As for gentlemen, the situation wasn't much easier. While men had more mobility and fewer taffeta-based burdens, their names still had to open doors. A mister could get in, but a sir, a captain, or better yet, a lord would be received with far more enthusiasm. If you were simply wealthy but without a title, well, you'd better have enough cash to make up for your lack of ancestors. Think, £10,000 a year, and a jawline you could slice fruit with, and heaven help you if you were new money. Aristocrats could sniff out commercial wealth the way pigs find truffles. A fortune built on coal, cotton, or anything practical was considered deeply vulgar, unless of course it was old vulgar money. Then it became charmingly rustic. To truly understand the cruelty of it all, imagine trying to attend a party where the bouncers are 80-year-old dowagers armed with fans, monocles, and generations of family grudges. Imagine sending your RFVP and then being told, quietly but definitively, that you must understand it's quite impossible. That's ton speak for absolutely not, darling. So if you're wondering why you wouldn't survive one night at a Regency ball, well, that's simple. You wouldn't even make it past the envelope. The Regency ballroom wasn't just a place of music, gossip, and strategic glances across the punch bowl. It was a battlefield of first impressions, and your entrance was your only chance to avoid becoming cannon fodder. You didn't just arrive at a ball, you debuted, and unless you knew how to glide into that chandelier-lit arena like a swan that had taken ballet, your social ranking was one twisted ankle away from collapse. Let's set the scene. The carriages have rolled up to the grand portico. You're deposited at the doors in a state of nervous perspiration, already internally composing your own obituary, died of social humiliation, survived by no one respectable. The doorman opens the door. The music swells. You see chandeliers, polished floors, glittering gowns, and 100 pairs of eyes primed for judgment. Now all you have to do is walk 36 feet across the room without tripping, sweating, or appearing too eager. Good luck, because this isn't just an entrance, it's a test. One you weren't told the rules for, but will absolutely be punished for failing. For ladies, the moment you stepped into the ballroom was akin to being paraded like a prize mare at auction. If the auction was held by people who smiled while simultaneously dissecting your posture, your hemline, and whether your mother's third cousin once married beneath her station, the curtsy was your formal introduction. And it wasn't just a dainty dip, oh no, a Regency curtsy was a full performance. Knees bent, back straight, chin level, eyes lowered, you had to give the impression of grace, submission, and poise without looking like you were auditioning for a job as a floorboard inspector. A curtsy too shallow, unrefined, too deep, desperate, lose your balance halfway down? Congratulations, you're now the anecdote of the evening, forever. Men didn't have it easy either. Bows were their version of social currency, and getting it wrong was just as deadly. There were layers to this, literal depths to your bend, based on the recipient's gender, status, and the likelihood they'd one day control your financial future. Too stiff, and you looked arrogant. Too floppy, and you looked like you were trying to extract a coin from your shoe. The perfect Regency bow involved precision, one foot behind the other, head inclined just so, arms by your sides, no wild flailing. This wasn't semaphore. Bonus points if you could deliver it with a slight smile that said, "I respect you," and not, "I'm trying not to vomit." And if you were lucky or unfortunate enough to be a debutante, this entrance was your societal premiere. You'd be led in, sometimes literally announced by name, your dance card blank, and your future uncertain. Mothers watched you like racehorse owners. Suitors observed like they were at a livestock judging contest. Every step, blink, and breath was dissected. Smiled too wide, flighty, didn't smile at all, cold, smiled at the wrong man, ruined. Then there was the walk across the ballroom floor, a journey as treacherous as Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. The floor was polished to a blinding sheen, and your shoes had soles thinner than social tolerance. One wrong step, and you'd find yourself sliding toward the orchestra like a Regency curling stone. God forbid you stumbled. God forbid your train snagged. God forbid you touched a piece of furniture for balance. Nothing screamed unfit for marriage, like using a sideboard as a crutch. Eye contact was also a danger zone. Locking eyes with someone for too long could be interpreted as flirtation, contempt, or worse, interest. Accidentally gazing at a married man, scandal. Accidentally ignoring a titled widow, insult. And accidentally making eye contact with Lady Wentworth's Pomeranian. Well, even that beast was higher up the social ladder than you, and if you were escorted in by your family, things could unravel even faster. Parents had a magical ability to ruin everything by simply existing. A mother's too loud whisper, "Stand up straight, Caroline, you're slouching like a stable boy." A father in an outdated waistcoat. Social suicide by association. You may have been the picture of poise, but if your uncle once insulted someone's gooseberry tart at a garden party in 1807, the stain remained. There were, of course, the professional socialites, those glittering veterans who could float into a ballroom as if they were born on invisible clouds of superiority. They glided, they sparkled, they bowed with the elegance of a ballet-trained flamingo. You hated them instantly and aspired to become them immediately. So yes, one misstep could ruin your entire season. You might have perfect conversation, flawless taste in poetry, and a dowry that could fund a small war, but if you tripped on your petticoat while entering the ballroom, you were done, laughed about, whispered over, remembered not as Lady Eleanor's charming cousin, but as that girl who curtsied into the potted fern. Because in Regency England, reputation wasn't built slowly, it was shattered instantly. A dancing, the heartbeat of any Regency ball. The elegant collision of social ambition, flirtation, and mild cardio. On the surface, it looked like grace and poise, all twirls and smiles and floating around a ballroom like an aristocratic cloud. But peel back the layers, and Regency dancing was less a pastime and more a competitive blood sport where the only way to survive was to memorize 37 choreographed steps, bow at a precise 37-degree angle, and make sure you didn't accidentally elbow the Earl of Hampshire in the spleen. Again, let's start with the types of dances, because the Regency period wasn't satisfied with a single way to make you sweat publicly in formal wear. You had cotillions, quadrilles, reels, and country dances, each more complicated than the last, and all requiring the kind of memory usually reserved for Shakespearean actors and MI6 agents. Cotillions were French imports, the social equivalent of assembling IKEA furniture with your feet. They involved 4 couples in a square formation, executing a series of intricate patterns with precision and timing. Think of it as the original group project, where one person messing up meant everyone looked bad and no one got dessert. Then came the quadrille, the aristocracy's favorite form of torture. More elegant than the cotillion, but just as confusing. It had 5 different sections, each with its own unique movements, and all of them had to be performed in perfect synchronization with the music and your fellow dancers. Miss a cue, and you didn't just embarrass yourself, you threw off the whole ballroom, which would be remembered by everyone, including Lady Bletchworth's parrot, which had a suspicious habit of mimicking public failures. Reels, on the other hand, were fast-paced, energetic, and slightly chaotic, involving rapid footwork and whirling changes of partners. They were more fun than the others, unless of course your coordination was somewhere between baby deer on ice and recently reanimated corpse. Nothing says marriage material like spinning into the wrong partner and headbutting the Marquess of Devon. And country dances, the backbone of the English dance scene, were long flowing affairs that could last for half an hour, which sounds romantic until you remember you're wearing 20 pounds of silk and breathing through a corset or cravat. The same sequence of steps repeated again and again as couples moved down the line, smiling graciously even as their calves quietly begged for mercy. Now here's the catch. Everyone already knew the steps, or rather, everyone was expected to know the steps. Young people were taught dancing from the time they were old enough to stand, because proper dancing wasn't just entertainment, it was etiquette. Dancing was your chance to demonstrate that you were cultured, well-bred, and physically capable of coordinated motion. 3 qualities any self-respecting Regency suitor required in a potential spouse. Which brings us to you, our poor, modern, unsuspecting time traveler. You've made it into the ballroom. You've bowed without toppling a statue, and now someone, usually a mother with matchmaking in her eyes, is gently shoving you toward the dance floor. The music starts. Your palms are sweating. The line forms. You're paired with someone named something like Lord Percival Thistlebank III. He smiles. You panic. The first step begins, and you don't. You step left when everyone else steps right. You bow when you were supposed to twirl. You try to copy the couple in front of you, only to realize they're doing an entirely different dance because you're in the wrong set. In less than 30 seconds, you've managed to offend 3 noblemen, trip over a hem, and invent a new form of interpretive flailing. You are now both legend and cautionary tale. And then there's the dance card, that dainty little booklet every lady carried, listing all the evening's dances and who she'd be partnering with for each. In theory, it was a charming organizational tool. In practice, it was a social minefield. A blank card. Devastating. A card filled with dullards and distant cousins. Just as bad. Too many dances with the same gentleman. Scandalous. Too few dances. You might as well retire to the countryside and take up embroidery. Ladies had to navigate invitations with the skill of a diplomat. Accept too eagerly and you're desperate. Too coldly and you're standoffish. And heaven help you if you accepted a dance and forgot it. Few offences were more socially fatal than double booking a waltz. Gentlemen, for their part, had to initiate the request. But there were rules. You couldn't ask a lady for more than 2 dances in one night, unless you were about to propose, elope, or duel someone on her behalf. Even making eye contact during a dance request was subject to interpretation. Was he being polite? Was he in love? Was he about to sneeze? In short, dancing in the Regency era was less enjoyable night of music and more live-action social resume with rhythmic footwork. The choreography was so intense you'd think they were preparing to storm the Bastille. Everyone watched, everyone remembered, and everyone judged. So yes, by all means dance like everyone's watching, because they are, and they have notebooks. Welcome to the Regency ballroom, the only place where silence was deadly and words were even deadlier. You might think surviving the entrance and making it through one round of the quadrille means you're safe. But no. Now you face your most perilous challenge yet, talking. Not just talking, talking correctly. Conversing in the rigid, unspoken dialect of Regency respectability, a tongue so delicate, so precise that deviating from it by a fraction of a sentence could sentence your future to spinsterhood, scandal, or a sudden exile to your aunt's cottage in the north. Let's start with the basics. Regency small talk operated under stricter regulations than Napoleonic warfare. You couldn't just say what you thought. Heavens no. You had to say what was appropriate, filtered through a series of social sieves that rendered everything inoffensive, uncontroversial, and as emotionally thrilling as a lukewarm bowl of blancmange. Topics were limited to a tight, suffocating list. The weather, but only if you weren't too passionate about it. The latest bowl, only if everyone agreed it was charming. Music, only if you didn't accidentally insult someone's pianoforte technique. Horses, safe, until someone's mare misbehaved last Tuesday. Fashion, compliments only. Criticism was a death sentence. Want to discuss the country? Absolutely not. Religion, are you mad? Money, only in veiled euphemisms. Illness, only if it's someone else's, and they're already unalive. You had to speak around things, like a verbal waltz, gracefully circling your meaning without ever landing on it. Witty banter, of course, was valued, but not too much. If you were a gentleman, you were expected to be clever, charming, and dashing, preferably all at once, and preferably without sounding like you were trying. For ladies, however, things were trickier. Wit was like perfume. A hint was delightful, too much, and people started whispering that you wrote novels, satirical ones, with opinions. Say something too clever and suddenly you're forward. Say something too dull and you're a cabbage with bangs. The line between enchanting conversationalist and unmarriageable liability was razor thin, and sharpened hourly by elderly chaperones clutching teacups like loaded weapons. And then there were the conversational traps, things you might not even realize were dangerous until you were already neck-deep in disgrace. For example, referring to a recent visit to Bath, lovely, unless someone at the table's cousin caught a chill there in No. 3 and never recovered. Mentioning your fondness for poetry, delightful, unless your poem has undertones or worse, was French. Laughing too loudly? Absolutely not. Laughing at the wrong moment? Unforgivable. Laughing at all? Risky. You see, in the Regency world, language wasn't for self-expression, it was for social navigation. Every phrase was a maneuver, every comment a potential marriage pitch or reputational landmine. You weren't just making conversation, you were performing a verbal minuet, and if your foot slipped, so did your chances of being asked to the next ball. Let's illustrate. Imagine a young lady is making small talk with a gentleman during a country dance. She says, "The weather has been rather fine, has it not?" He replies, "Indeed, Miss Ellsworth, though I did find last Thursday unusually warm for April." She beams, "Yes, quite unseasonable. I fear I wilted like a camellia. Perfect. Light, flirtatious, seasonally relevant, social gold." Now imagine a different young lady, less experienced in the subtle art of saying nothing with flair. She says, "I find these balls insufferably tedious." Silence. Suddenly she's a sour grape in a fruit salad of charm. Her dance partner excuses himself. Lady Agatha whispers into her fan. Someone's monocle falls out in shock. Within hours she's known as that girl who hates balls, which in Regency slang was worse than being called a highwayman. Even seemingly harmless compliments had to be handled with the delicacy of a Fabergé egg. Saying someone's gown was interesting was basically calling it a tragedy. Calling a man's cravat brave implied it had lost a duel with taste. Misusing a single adjective could start a feud lasting 3 generations. And let's not forget eavesdroppers, the Regency version of surveillance drones. Every corner had a dowager duchess with sonar-level hearing, and nothing better to do than catalogue your verbal missteps. If you said something even mildly controversial, you could bet it would be recounted in 3 drawing rooms, 2 letters, and 1 satirical poem by breakfast. So if you managed to survive a full evening of conversation without offending a marquess, insulting a pianist, or expressing an original thought, congratulations, you were a Regency legend. In summary, small talk in the Regency ballroom was like fencing with embroidery needles, delicate, dangerous, and entirely designed to draw blood. One wrong word, and suddenly you're branded a radical, a flirt, or worse, a woman with opinions. And heaven help you if you said something funny. That was the most dangerous thing of all. Welcome to the dining side of the Regency ball, where every bite is a gamble, and every nibble might cost you your dignity. The modern guest might expect hors d'oeuvres, perhaps a charcuterie board, or at least a canapé that isn't trying to jellify itself off the table. But here, the phrase culinary delight is more of a polite fiction than a culinary reality. Let's begin with the Regency spread itself. Picture a long table groaning under the weight of jellied meats, savoury aspics, congealed poultry, and the ever-present meat pie, which frankly could contain anything from mutton to mystery. Food presentation in the early 19th century favoured quantity, not clarity. If it wiggled when poked but wasn't dessert, congratulations, you'd found the aspic. It was cold, slimy, and somehow proudly centre stage. And then there was the jelly. Not your innocent strawberry jam kind, mind you, but meat jelly, made from boiling down bones, skin, and whatever else the butcher had lying around until it created a translucent goo. This shimmering mass would be moulded into strange shapes, then proudly plopped on the table like a gelatinous tribute to questionable choices. Think of it as Regency cuisine's way of saying, we don't need refrigeration, we have denial. Now, if you were lucky, you might encounter something more digestible, perhaps a cold roast, a slice of game, or a meat pie that had been baked less than a week ago. But even those came with caveats. Preservation techniques in the era mostly involved salt, vinegar, or an unshakable optimism that the meat wasn't that spoiled. Food safety laws, not a thing. Most of the aristocracy believed bacteria were a French rumor and that a good layer of gravy could mask anything. And speaking of masking, let's talk about the drinks. Regency punch bowls were legends in their own right. These weren't the child-friendly, fruit-based delights you find at weddings today. No, these were potent brews that could knock out a medium-sized horse. Common recipes called for brandy, rum, wine, citrus, spices, and then more alcohol for good measure. Some included milk, which curdled in protest, and others threw in entire pineapples, just to show they could. And yes, everything was served at room temperature, because ice was rare and expensive, and nobody wanted to explain to their guests that the frost was imported at absurd cost, just to chill the regrets. Now imagine sipping on a glass of lukewarm brandy-laced citrus stew while making polite conversation about your second cousin's elopement scandal. If the taste didn't get you, the alcohol content might, and heaven forbid you drank too much. One stumble into the punch bowl and your prospects were less eligible debutante and more cautionary tale. But navigating the food wasn't just about avoiding digestive doom. Your reputation was on the line too. Eat too much and you were branded as vulgar. Eat too little and you were delicate or possibly ill, which could torpedo marriage prospects faster than a revealed family bankruptcy. Taking second helpings was risky, but so was not taking any at all. Regency guests had to perform appetite with the precision of a ballet, appearing enthusiastic but not greedy, grateful but not gluttonous. The true delicacy wasn't the pâté, it was maintaining plausible daintiness while chewing. Ladies especially were under pressure to eat like a sparrow, which is poetic until you remember that sparrows eat insects and crumbs, not grey mutton swimming in a moat of lard. A single slip of the tongue, literal or verbal, and suddenly you're the talk of the ton. Did you see Miss Beckett devour an entire veal pasty? Scandalous. Is she hiding a pregnancy? Or worse, a working metabolism? Even cutlery posed challenges. Forks had only recently gained widespread use, and etiquette dictated how to wield them with the grace of a duchess, while wearing gloves that didn't allow for finger dexterity. Imagine trying to dissect a meat pie with all the elegance of a Victorian ninja. One false move and the contents of your plate might flee onto a duke's lap. Then there was the ever-present risk of food poisoning. Though it wasn't called that, more like a slight indisposition or the vapors. If you had to excuse yourself early due to oyster-induced gastrointestinal rebellion, the polite world didn't inquire further. They simply nodded, smiled, and mentally scratched your name off the dance card and the marriage prospects list. Yet, despite the perils, no one dared skip the buffet. To avoid it would be considered rude, suspicious even, and so you went. You ate, you smiled, you pretended to love the texture of meat that jiggles, and you prayed the punch wasn't hiding gin's angry cousin. In the end, the Regency ball buffet was less about nourishment and more about endurance. If you made it through the feast without spilling on your gloves, burping mid-conversation, or becoming intimately acquainted with the privy, congratulations, you had passed one of the evening's greatest unspoken tests. The next test, dancing, on a full stomach, in a corset. But that's for another chapter. If you thought Regency balls were all about waltzing and witty conversation, think again. The true main event wasn't the dancing. It wasn't the food. It wasn't even the desperate pursuit of matrimony. No, the real entertainment was as sharp as a lace fan to the face, and as lethal as a misfired musket, gossip. In Regency England, gossip wasn't just a pastime. It was a professional sport with high stakes, permanent consequences, and no off-season. Entire reputations rose and fell on the delicate flick of an eyebrow or the passive-aggressive sip of tea. Think of it as live-action social media, but with worse lighting and fewer character limits. Within the elite circle known as the ton, the creme de la creme of British high society, gossip was the unofficial currency. There was no such thing as just observing at a ball. Every glance, whisper, and eyebrow twitch was part of a complex code decipherable only by those trained in the ancient art of Regency shade. Did Miss Fairfax arrive wearing lilac after Lent? Scandalous. Did Lord Blakemore choose to dance with a widow twice? Positively indecent. Was Lady Danbury's décolletage a touch too enthusiastic for someone of her station? Get the smelling salts. Every action, every breath was scrutinized with the intensity of a royal inquisition and the glee of a theatre crowd spotting someone trip on stage. Information spread not in minutes, but seconds. The moment someone said something even remotely controversial, such as expressing enthusiasm for French poetry, or worse, being caught enjoying a second helping of syllabub, it was practically international news. Not because it mattered, but because it could matter if spun hard enough. And spin it they did. The ladies with the sharpest fans and sharper tongues made sure the rumour mill churned faster than a poorly supervised punch bowl. It was often the tiniest things that birthed the most titanic scandals. A lingering glance became a love affair. A dropped glove turned into an engagement. A sneeze in the wrong direction. Tuberculosis by morning. You could spend an entire season perfecting your wardrobe, your mannerisms, your marriage strategy, and then lose everything because Lady Featherstone thought she heard someone say you once visited Bath for medical reasons. And just like that, your chances of landing Lord Talrich and his 20,000 a year were as dead as your social credibility. This was a world where she's pleasant could either mean what a charming lady, or she's so boring, a portrait of her yawns. Even dukes weren't safe. High rank didn't protect you from the whisper network. It just made your missteps all the more thrilling to report. A wayward earl or a smirking marquess made excellent gossip fodder. The higher the title, the juicier the downfall. These balls were practically crawling with unpaid intelligence officers, older matrons strategically stationed on velvet benches, fans fluttering, eyes narrowing. They weren't there to dance or enjoy themselves. They were there to document everything. Was that a snub? Did that couple spend 2 dances together? Did Miss Wexley's hair look different? These weren't idle questions. These were the building blocks of next week's social warfare. You never knew when you were being evaluated for fashion violations, moral breaches, or scandal potential. You could be halfway through a conversation before realizing the nice lady asking about your aunt's gout was in fact harvesting details to take down your entire family line. Once your reputation cracked, there was no putting it back together. A single whispered rumor, however baseless, could exile you from polite society. And exile didn't just mean fewer dinner invites. It meant marriage was off the table. It meant your family might disown you. It meant your only companion for the rest of your life might be a sour-tempered lapdog named Wellington and a subscription to eternal embroidery. Even worse, sometimes the rumors weren't even about you. Guilt by association was very much a thing. Did your second cousin run off with a French violinist? Guess who's now socially radioactive? The gossip didn't pause once the dancing stopped. It continued in carriages, over breakfast, and in long meandering letters to far-off cousins. Dear Harriet, they would begin innocently. You'll never guess who was seen emerging from the conservatory unchaperoned. Of course, there were winners too. Occasionally, a clever lady could use gossip to her advantage, say by mysteriously disappearing for 15 minutes with a baron and then casually returning with just enough tousled hair to provoke curiosity. The right kind of scandal, well managed, could launch a woman straight into a titled marriage. But for every Cinderella, there were 3 Charlottes sent home in disgrace. So next time you imagine the Regency ball as a genteel gathering of polite conversation and tasteful flirtation, remember this: you were never really there to dance. You were there to survive the public relations equivalent of a knife fight, waged with whispers and smiles, because in this world, if you didn't bring scandal, someone would lend you theirs and charge interest. Welcome to the Regency ballroom, a gilded cage of candlelight, fan fluttering, and enough social rules to make a modern tax attorney weep. It was a place where everything looked effortless, but behind the lace gloves and powdered faces lurked a minefield of unspoken expectations. And the terrifying part, you were expected to know them, all of them, instinctively, without asking. Otherwise, you'd be socially detonated before the second dance. Let's begin with a harmless-sounding faux pas, standing in the wrong part of the room. Surely you might think, one floorboard is as good as another. Oh no. Each square foot of parquet carried a social weight heavier than a disgraced duchess's jewelry box. The left side of the room might be reserved for married ladies, the right for eligible debutantes. The back corners, that's where the wallflowers went to die, or at least readjust their gloves while pretending they weren't dying. If you parked yourself in the wrong section, you risked everything from appearing presumptuous to being mistaken for someone else's governess. And if you stood too close to the musicians, heaven help you, you'd be seen as a common music lover. Imagine the disgrace. Even standing still came with baggage. You couldn't remain seated too long because that screamed, "No one has asked me to dance," which was a one-way ticket to the land of social invisibility. Too much sitting suggested either unpopularity or tuberculosis, neither of which was considered alluring. But moving around too much made you look desperate, and desperate was just another word for doomed. There was an art to fidgeting in place with subtle grace, as if you were simultaneously poised and bored, available and aloof. It was like being a cat, but in a bonnet. Now, let's talk about the great dance invitation minefield. At first glance it seems simple. A gentleman asks, a lady accepts, they take a turn on the floor. But the rules that governed these exchanges were a tapestry of anxiety and silent judgment. For example, you could not, under any circumstances, ask for a second dance with the same person unless they were a sibling, a fiancé, or a ghost from your shared tragic backstory. A second dance was practically a public declaration of romantic intent. Do it too early in the evening and suddenly, congratulations, you're mentally engaged by half the ballroom and expected to produce heirs by next spring. And of course you couldn't ask for a dance at all if you were a lady. Initiating anything beyond a modest cough to signal your presence would be akin to proposing marriage on the spot. Gentlemen did the asking, and even they had to tread carefully. Ask too many ladies and you were flighty. Ask only one, and you're suspicious. Ask someone too far beneath your station, scandal. Ask someone too far above it, utter humiliation. And for goodness sake, don't get the order of the dances wrong. A waltz wasn't just a waltz. It was a rotating courtship, literally. Then there were the glances. Oh, the glances. Eye contact was the Morse code of the ballroom, and a single glance could convey everything from interest to utter revulsion. But be careful. Look too long, and people assumed you were arranging an elopement. Look too little, and they thought you were cold. God forbid your gaze linger on someone's cufflink. That could be interpreted as admiration, disdain, or a brewing scandal involving haberdashery. And if you accidentally caught the eye of a chaperone, game over. They'd home in like a hawk with monocles, prepared to either intervene or summon your mother with a glare. Let's not forget the unspoken etiquette surrounding fan language, which was somehow a thing. Yes, fans. Those fluttering tools of flirtation, heat relief, and accidental assault were part of an elaborate code. Open it slowly. You're interested. Snap it closed. Not today, sir. Touch it to your cheek. Dreamy thoughts. Drop it on the floor. Either you're clumsy or proposing a scandal. Naturally, no one ever told you this directly. You were supposed to pick it up through osmosis or whispered gossip during embroidery class. Even your refreshments had rules. Accepting punch from the wrong gentleman implied intimacy. Refusing a treat from an eligible suitor might brand you as cold-hearted, health-obsessed, or untrusting of Regency kitchen staff, and frankly fair. Napkins weren't just for dabbing delicately. They were signals, like semaphore flags for your social standing. And let's not even start on conversational spacing. Standing too close, forward. Too far, cold. Facing the wrong angle, you just turned your back on someone's future dowry. The geometry of human interaction was studied more carefully than Newton's laws, and failure to obey it meant exile from polite society, or worse, a stern letter from your aunt. In short, surviving the unspoken rules of a Regency ball required you to be part dancer, part actress, part court stenographer, and part psychic. You had to navigate centuries of cultural expectation without a single handbook. The only manual was gossip, and by the time you'd heard about Lady Fairweather's infamous handkerchief blunder, you'd already made it yourself twice. If the Regency ball began with elegance, poise, and the promise of genteel conversation under the glittering chandeliers, by midnight it had all slipped into something far more interpretive. The polished veneer of aristocratic restraint gave way to a scene that looked like the Jane Austen version of a mosh pit, only with more lace, rum punch, and regrettable declarations of undying love. To be clear, the final act of a Regency ball was not for the faint of heart or the sober. Somewhere around the 9th cotillion and the 4th glass of heavily fortified claret punch, the line between social decorum and I dare you to climb the fountain became perilously thin. People who had earlier discussed the merits of Greek sculpture were now slumped in embroidered chairs, whispering secrets to doilies. A typical Regency evening might end at 2 or even 4 a.m. A logistical nightmare if you factor in how tight the corsets were and how unforgiving 19th century shoes could be. Feet were blistered, wigs askew, and the occasional satin slipper could be seen abandoned in the corner like some tragic Cinderella casualty. That was just the beginning. The real chaos began when the punch bowl, now a suspicious shade of pinkish brown, had taken enough victims. Emboldened by brandy and the stress of 6 hours of conversation that didn't include a single sincere emotion, the gentleman began to act less like Darcy and more like a hazard. Proposals of marriage flowed like wine, often issued to the wrong sister, the wrong cousin, or in at least one well-documented disaster, a large decorative urn. Social boundaries that once held the evening together like polite duct tape began to fray at the seams. Fainting ladies, once considered the mark of gentle femininity, began to dot the room like someone had installed a Victorian version of a fire drill. Some swooned from genuine exhaustion, or the shock of being told their gown was last season. Others simply gave up and collapsed dramatically into the arms of the nearest gentleman, whether or not he was available, awake, or in the right species category. And make no mistake, fainting gracefully required skill. You had to land elegantly, preferably near a chaise longue, and without knocking over the fruit display. Meanwhile, the anteroom, the supposed refuge for quiet conversation and genteel refreshment, had become the unofficial triage unit. Here you'd find at least 3 people snoring softly with punch-stained cravats, someone composing bad poetry with their shoe, and another noble attempting to duel a roast goose over a perceived insult. A handful clutched meat pies with the desperation of soldiers on a battlefield, their eyes hollow from too many reels and too little judgment. For the maids and footmen, this was the witching hour. What began as a stately evening now required full emergency protocol. They had to herd stumbling nobles toward their carriages, mop up spilled syllabub from the walls, and delicately remove Lady Penelope from the potted palm she was insisting was her long-lost fiancé. It was like working crowd control at a toga party, thrown by people who thought olives were medicinal and modesty optional. The musicians, who had played through 12 sets of dances with a dedication bordering on martyrdom, often packed up quietly and tried to sneak out, hoping to escape before some inebriated lord asked them to play just one more jig while trying to climb onto the harpsichord. But perhaps the most treacherous part of all was leaving. You couldn't just slink out unnoticed, not unless you wanted to be the subject of intense speculation the next morning. Did she leave with the colonel, with the baronet, or was she carried out in the soup tureen? The exit, like the entrance, had to be performed with just enough grace to say, "Yes, I'm still composed," and just enough haste to escape any further scandal. Ideally, your departure didn't include slipping in your own petticoats or knocking over a duchess. By the time the last guests were bundled into their carriages, wigs were drooping like soggy soufflé, reputations were hanging by a thread, and someone's great-aunt was asking if Napoleon had shown up yet. The ballroom floor was a battlefield of trampled feathers, discarded gloves, and the broken dreams of 5 young debutantes and 1 disillusioned earl. So, if you thought surviving the first hour of a Regency ball was tough, just wait until the punch hits your kidneys. Your dance partner starts quoting Byron from the staircase, and you wake up with your head in a tureen of lobster jelly, wondering why someone is calling you Baroness Pie Clutch. The ball is over, the candles are snuffed, The musicians have finally collapsed into their chairs, and the lingering scent of lavender perfume, sweat, and boiled mutton hangs in the air like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. You've managed to escape the dance floor without colliding with a single duchess, only mildly disgraced yourself at the buffet table, and survived 17 rounds of small talk without proposing marriage to anyone by accident. But don't relax yet. The real carnage begins now, because in Regency society, a ball wasn't just a party. It was a test, a resume, a battlefield, and a live-action episode of Survivor Ton Edition. And now, the jury is in deliberation. By morning, you'll either be celebrated as the belle of the season, or condemned to the social gallows, hung by the silk ribbon of your slightly wilted tiara. As the first rays of dawn crawl over the English countryside, the judgment hour arrives. Footmen are dispatched like caffeinated carrier pigeons, clutching letters and notes scribbled furiously in the back of carriages. Miss Ashworth danced twice with Lord Penfield, and laughed too hard at his joke about French wine suspicious. Lady Winthrop's daughter arrived with feathers that were clearly last season, and everyone saw Mr. Everleigh sneaking off into the garden with someone who was definitely not on his dance card. Gossip travels fast in the Ton, faster than any horse-drawn carriage or homing pigeon. Before you've even had your morning tea, your entire night has been dissected and distributed across London like scandal-flavoured jam. Lady Featherstone, she of the lethal teacup and sharper tongue, has already begun her morning campaign. Her drawing room, now a war council, is filled with yawning debutantes nursing their feet while whispering about who spilled punch on Viscount Turner's trousers and whether it was truly an accident. Meanwhile, you sit in your chamber, a human ruin wrapped in muslin. Your hair looks like it lost a duel. Your gloves are missing, left behind on a settee in a moment of sweaty desperation. Your hem is suspiciously stained, and you can't remember whether you called Lord Willoughby your grace or your grapes. Either way, he looked confused. And physically, you feel like you've just completed a marathon in slippers. Your calves ache, your back is knotted into a shape last seen in contortionist acts, and the soles of your feet resemble battlefield terrain. But that's nothing compared to the psychological bruises, the haunting memory of tripping during the third reel, the look Lady Bambridge gave you after you interrupted her anecdote about her prize-winning pet ferret, the gnawing dread that someone overheard you refer to the goose jelly as sinister. Still, you did your duty. You curtsied, you conversed, you danced like a semi-sentient puppet with good posture. And for all that, your fate now lies in the hands of a gossipy aristocracy, armed with fans, quills, and the kind of memory usually reserved for elephants and professional grudge holders. In the days that follow, you'll be haunted by echoes of the ball, mentions in the gossip columns. Miss Blake was seen engaging in spirited conversation with the heir to the Somersham estate, unsolicited commentary from great aunts. I saw you dancing with that man with the weak chin, bold choice, and unsolicited compliments that feel suspiciously like attacks. Your dress was so unusual. I could never pull off that colour. Reputation management becomes a full-time job. You write polite notes to everyone you danced with, hoping to remind them you exist, but not so forcefully that they think you're desperate. You lie awake at night, wondering if you laughed too loudly, danced too enthusiastically, or ate too much trifle. You did. You always do. But maybe, just maybe, there's a silver lining. Perhaps your witty remark about imported cheese reached the right ears. Maybe Lord Dunsley liked your curtsy enough to write to your father. Maybe your slightly off-kilter headpiece is being called avant-garde by someone important. Regardless of the outcome, one thing is certain. You are no longer the person who walked into that ballroom. You are a battle-worn veteran of the Ton's most grueling campaign. You've tasted the jelly, endured the gossip, and twirled your way through a minefield of etiquette with only minor scarring. And in a few weeks' time, you'll do it all again, because in Regency society, survival isn't the goal. Domination is. In a world where plastic is everywhere, wrapped around your online impulse buys, cushioning your electronics, and occasionally stuck to your foot like a clingy ghost, there exists a humble hero made entirely of air and dreams, bubble wrap. It's the kind of thing we all know. We've squished it, popped it, compulsively flattened every last bubble like a miniature tyrant ruling over a kingdom of air pockets. And yet few people pause to ask the deeper questions. Where did it come from? Who looked at plastic and thought, you know what this needs? Trapped air in bulk. Why is it so weirdly satisfying to obliterate it bubble by bubble? To understand this unlikely cultural icon, we need to rewind the tape, or in this case peel back the plastic, to a time when the world was practically bubbling over with innovation. Welcome to the 1950s, a decade where science fiction collided with interior design, and everything was either chrome, electric, radioactive, or vaguely suspicious. This was an era that believed in flying cars, robot maids, and personal atomic power plants, and more importantly, that design could save the world. If your living room didn't look like a spaceship crash-landed in suburbia, were you even keeping up? This was the golden age of modernity fever, and Americans were redecorating like their wallpaper might actually report them to the neighbors for being outdated. Textures, patterns, and synthetic materials were all the rage. Wallpaper wasn't just background noise, it was a statement, a chance to say we are tasteful, futuristic, and slightly unhinged. Enter two inventors, Alfred Fielding and Marc Chavans, who looked at the walls of the 1950s and saw potential, or, more accurately, they saw a business opportunity wrapped in a strange idea: three-dimensional plastic wallpaper. Yes, you heard that right. Wallpaper with texture, depth, and air bubbles. Imagine looking at your wall and thinking, this needs to look more like packing material, and then doing something about it. Their original concept wasn't the bubble wrap we know today. It was decorative. They envisioned a modern, futuristic vibe, something that screamed spaceman chic with the aesthetic of a microwaved shower curtain. And for just a moment, in a garage somewhere in Hawthorne, New Jersey, two men genuinely believed the future of interior design was inflatable walls. Unfortunately, the rest of humanity took one look and collectively said no, even in an era when people willingly installed carpet in bathrooms and ashtrays in car armrests. Bubble wallpaper was a bridge too far. It was weird, it was hard to clean, and more importantly, it made your walls look like they had a skin condition. Still, credit where credit is due. Fielding and Chavans were trying to innovate. They weren't chasing vanity or trendiness. Okay, maybe a little. They were attempting to create something new to leave a plastic mark on history, and that they did, just not in the way they intended. Here lies the delicious twist in our story. This laughably doomed wallpaper idea didn't fade into obscurity like other 1950s decorating disasters. Looking at you, avocado green everything. No, it hung on, it waited, it bided its time, and eventually, like all good underdog tales, it reinvented itself. Because bubble wrap, this ridiculous bubbly reject of a decorating scheme, was about to discover its true purpose. Not on walls, not in the pages, but in warehouses, shipping departments, and eventually your childhood joy zone. But we'll get there soon enough. For now, let's take a moment to appreciate the absurdity of it all. A product born in a decade of hair gel, Sputnik panic, and furniture made entirely out of fiberglass, created not by accident, but with total unflinching intention. These guys meant it. They meant to wrap your entire living room in air-filled plastic. And honestly, that kind of commitment deserves at least a golf clap. So next time you find yourself squashing a roll of bubble wrap like a toddler on a sugar high, remember, you're not just engaging in low-stakes destruction, you're connecting with a legacy of failure so spectacular it succeeded, because bubble wrap is proof that even the weirdest ideas can thrive if you just rebrand hard enough. In the great sprawling junkyard of failed ideas, somewhere between edible coffee cups and nuclear-powered vacuum cleaners, sits one of the most delightfully baffling inventions of the 20th century, bubble wallpaper. The brains behind this plastic misadventure, two American inventors, Alfred Fielding and Marc Chavans, whose collective resume might not scream interior decorators, but whose ambitions certainly did. In 1957, These two pioneers of the peculiar had a vision: textured modern wallpaper, perfect for the atomic age. Not some dainty floral paper or drab beige nonsense. No. Their vision was three-dimensional, dynamic, futuristic, and very, very bubbly. Let's pause and consider their state of mind. The 1950s were a time when people willingly installed shag carpet in kitchens, used asbestos like it was seasoning, and believed everything should look like it came from outer space. This was a post-war society ready to fly into the future on a rocket of formica and optimism. If your furniture didn't double as a missile silo, were you even trying? Fielding and Chavans weren't just riding this wave, they were surfing it, barefoot, holding a prototype made of polyethylene plastic and boundless confidence. Their idea was simple: take two plastic shower curtain-like sheets, seal them together in such a way that they formed little pockets of air bubbles, and slap it on your walls. Instant depth, texture, visual intrigue, a tactile conversation starter. What's not to love? A lot, as it turns out. While their product was undeniably innovative, after all, it had never been done before, there was one minor hiccup. No one wanted it. They weren't entirely off base. At the time, textured wallpaper was having a bit of a moment. Flocked wallpaper, the kind that looked like crushed velvet and was usually found in homes with way too many cigarette ashtrays, was trendy. Embossed patterns were considered chic. But bubble wallpaper, that wasn't avant-garde. That was, did your kid glue plastic to the wall again? Now imagine being a 1950s housewife, coiffed, apron-clad, flipping through House Beautiful while your fondue set simmers. You open the door to a salesman because, yes, back then this was how things were sold, and he enthusiastically gestures to your wall and says, "Imagine this, but with air pockets, and not just any air pockets, transparent ones, plastic ones, stuck in an evenly spaced, slightly medical-looking pattern. The kind of thing you might expect to find in a laboratory or the cargo hold of a very nervous space shuttle. This wasn't cozy, this wasn't charming, this was wall insulation dressed in a raincoat, pretending to be modern art." Fielding and Chavanaz nonetheless tried to sell it like it was the future. They pitched it as a sleek, contemporary alternative to traditional wallpaper. It could reflect light, create visual depth, clean easily. That one was probably a stretch. Have you ever tried wiping down individual bubbles? It's like trying to vacuum a trampoline. They even attempted to market it to commercial spaces, offices, airports, maybe even avant-garde nightclubs. Surely someone out there would want to live inside a plastic terrarium, but alas, the response was about as enthusiastic as lukewarm Jell-O. Interior decorators wouldn't touch it. Architects blinked in confusion. And consumers? Most of them were too polite to say, "This looks like my living room is molting." In hindsight, perhaps the name didn't help either. It was called bubble wallpaper, which sounds less like a design innovation and more like something that might occur after an unfortunate plumbing incident. It didn't convey elegance or style. It conveyed maintenance issues and lawsuits. But what's genuinely admirable and somehow hilarious is how seriously they took it. Fielding and Chavans weren't pranksters. They weren't pulling a stunt. They genuinely believed that walls covered in squishy plastic bubbles were the future. And honestly, you kind of have to respect that level of commitment. It takes a special kind of vision to invent a product nobody asked for, pitch it to the world, and not immediately flee the country when everyone laughs. Of course, the world wasn't ready, or maybe it was ready, but only in the same way it was ready for frozen TV dinners, lead-based toys, and doctors recommending cigarettes. Just because it's from the 1950s doesn't mean it was a good idea. Still, there's something endearing about bubble wallpaper. It's the kind of charming failure that reminds us innovation isn't always about getting it right the first time. Sometimes, it's about trying something so boldly weird that its usefulness only becomes obvious after it completely flops. Because while the idea of covering your home in pimpled plastic might sound laughable today, Fielding and Chavans had unwittingly stumbled upon something else, something much bigger than interior decorating. They hadn't invented the next big design trend, but they had created a substance unlike anything else in the world, one that would very soon find its true calling, At first glance, bubble wrap doesn't seem like much. It's squishy, translucent, and makes a noise that falls somewhere between satisfying crunch and tiny neck being snapped. It's a product you don't think about until you're joyfully desecrating it one bubble at a time. But hidden within this joyful plastic chaos is a surprisingly elegant little feat of engineering. And like most great inventions, it began with two guys, a garage, and probably no eye protection. Let's talk materials first. Polyethylene. If plastic had a prom queen, this would be her. It's the most common plastic in the world. Used in everything from plastic bags and water bottles to children's toys and things that mysteriously arrive from Amazon at 2 a.m. But in the hands of inventors Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavanix, this humble polymer became something new, something puffy, springy, and just fragile enough to make you feel bad when you pop it. The process? It's deceptively simple and weirdly magical. Take 2 sheets of polyethylene, heat one just enough so it softens, but doesn't melt into a sad puddle. Then, and here's the genius part, press it against a roller covered in tiny holes. Each hole is connected to a vacuum pump. As the softened plastic passes over, the air is sucked into those holes, forming little pockets. Voila! Instant bubbles. Then quickly press the second sheet on top to seal it, and boom, you now have a product that is somehow equal parts packaging and therapy. This process may sound clinical, even robotic, but the result is anything but. The sealed air in each bubble is a tiny cushion, a protective pocket of nothing that protects things that are very much something. That air is doing a lot more work than you think. It acts as a shock absorber, a pressure distributor, and if you're 10 years old and bored, a very loud toy. Now here's where it gets even better. Bubble wrap wasn't just a fluke of design. It was accidentally engineered to be tough. Polyethylene is resilient. The air bubbles can take quite a punch, not from a boxer, but certainly from the UPS journey from Cincinnati to your doorstep. It's water-resistant, stretchable, and surprisingly good at insulating, which brings us to the next very specific and slightly hilarious phase in bubble wrap history. Greenhouses. Yes, greenhouses. Before anyone was wrapping electronics in it, bubble wrap was, for a hot second, a candidate for thermal insulation in plant nurseries. The logic was kind of brilliant. Greenhouses need light and heat retention. Bubble wrap lets light in, and its air pockets trap warmth. Plus it's cheap, flexible, and comes in giant rolls that make you feel powerful just by holding them. Farmers and hobbyist botanists alike began to experiment with lining their greenhouse walls and ceilings with sheets of bubble wrap. It worked, in a kind of DIY, slightly sad, please don't judge my plants kind of way. Plants thrived under their weird, crinkly plastic roofs. Bubble wrap became the botanical world's weirdest wingman. Of course, there were drawbacks. On hot days, greenhouses risked turning into microwave ovens. Occasionally, trapped humidity would cause condensation inside the bubbles, making the whole thing look like your walls were crying. But still, not bad for something originally designed as fashion-forward wall decor. Bubble wrap had found yet another unexpected skill, botanical insulation. And here's the kicker, it still works. To this day you can find hobbyists and thrifty gardeners lining their greenhouses with bubble wrap in colder climates. Some even buy special UV-resistant agricultural-grade sheets, because apparently, once you start covering your plants in air pockets, you commit. What makes all this even more remarkable is that Fielding and Chavanez didn't go into their garage thinking, let's invent the most versatile material since duct tape. No, they were making art. The fact that their plastic experiment turned out to have structural integrity and thermal capabilities is one of history's better punchlines. They weren't trying to change the shipping industry or revolutionize greenhouse farming. They just wanted to make a wall look like it came from the Jetsons. And yet, by combining polyethylene, air, and just enough accidental brilliance, they managed to create a product that's not only functional but downright lovable. It's the golden retriever of packaging, friendly, dependable, and occasionally noisy, so the next time you pop a bubble with that smug, satisfying crack, remember what you're actually interacting with is a delicate balance of material science and unintentional genius. It's a little pocket of trapped air from the factory, protected by polymer, carefully sealed, and sent across the globe, all just to keep your ceramic mug safe or to give you 5 minutes of unhinged joy while your co-workers stare. Bubble wrap? Technically just air in plastic. Emotionally, a coping mechanism with a degree in chemistry. By the early 1960s, bubble wrap had officially flopped as interior design. The dream of covering suburban living rooms with inflatable polka dots was, mercifully, dead. But just when it seemed bubble wrap was destined to join the dusty graveyard of bad inventions alongside spray-on hair and the radium-infused alarm clock, something happened. Someone figured out how to make it useful, and that someone was IBM. Let's set the stage. Picture 1960s IBM. They weren't just selling typewriters anymore, they were churning out the very first computers, not the sleek laptops we casually hurl into backpacks today. No, these were room-sized beasts, packed with delicate components, blinking lights, and the occasional need for an actual forklift. And much like your modern-day phone screen, these things shattered if you so much as looked at them funny during shipping. IBM had a problem. How do you ship fragile, wildly expensive electronic equipment across the country without it arriving in 4,000 pieces and a note that just says, oops? Cue Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavannes again. Yes, the wallpaper guys. Still licking their wounds from the interior design world's rejection. They had refused to let their plastic progeny die. They had already tried pushing bubble wrap as insulation for greenhouses, but now they were thinking bigger. And then IBM gave them a lifeline so glorious you can almost hear the air hissing gently from a bubble in gratitude. IBM took one look at the bubbly mess and saw what interior designers could not. Protection. Pure, squishy, shock-absorbing protection. Suddenly, bubble wrap went from wall candy to packaging armor. The transition was so smooth it should have gotten a standing ovation, no longer just a solution in search of a problem. Bubble wrap had found its destiny, defending the fragile against the postal system's best attempts at destruction. And so, in 1960, Fielding and Chavannes officially founded the Sealed Air Corporation, which is easily one of the best examples of fake it till you make it in industrial history. They had a product with no clear use, a business built on a failed design trend, and two guys who were winging it harder than a chicken in a wind tunnel. But now, they had IBM as their first major client, and the game changed. Their first big packaging client, aside from IBM, was a florist. And yes, the early product was occasionally used to wrap around flower stems. Imagine handing your sweetheart a bouquet lovingly encased in crackly plastic bubbles. Romantic? Maybe not. Effective? Very. By the mid-60s, Sealed Air was expanding fast. Their product was being used to ship all kinds of things, electronics, glassware, even the occasional ceramic gnome. Packaging, once the boring afterthought of the shipping process, was suddenly cutting edge. Protective cushioning was no longer shredded newspaper or old socks. It was engineered air, industrial marshmallows, a poppable promise that your parcel might arrive in one piece. And yet, let's not overlook how strange this transition was. One moment, Fielding and Chavannes were pitching their idea to interior decorators with a straight face. Just imagine this covering your whole bathroom. And the next, they were supplying international tech companies with precision cushioning. That's not just a pivot. That's a pirouette on ice skates. But this pivot wasn't just about finding a new customer. It was about fully rebranding the product. Fielding and Chavannes didn't just say, hey, here's our failed wallpaper. They said, here's the future of packaging. That's the kind of marketing boldness that separates legends from, well, people who just end up yelling at strangers in hardware stores. They gave bubble wrap a new identity, one with purpose. They weren't selling a novelty anymore. They were solving a problem. And that's what saved the pop. Without that pivot, bubble wrap would have remained a footnote in design disaster textbooks, filed somewhere between velvet paintings and lava lamps. Instead, the product evolved into something no warehouse, no e-commerce company, and no nervous gift wrapper could live without. It was reliable, it was squishy, and it made a noise that felt oddly satisfying in the soul. So next time you open a package and instinctively start popping away, remember you're enjoying the fruit of a marketing miracle, a resurrection, a second chance for the strangest wallpaper in history. And IBM? They got their computers delivered intact. Fielding and Chavans got their redemption arc. And we got bubble burritos for all our breakables. Everybody won. Well, except the decorators. But let's be honest, even they were probably popping it under the table. By the time Sealed Air Corporation got rolling in the 1960s, they were already sitting on one of the weirdest success stories in modern product history. They had a plastic sheet full of tiny pillows of air that nobody wanted to hang on their wall. The logical question was, how do you market something that is essentially nothing? Well, you lean in hard and sell the air. Let's start with a little context. This was a time when marketing departments were still discovering that jingles could get stuck in your head longer than a bad decision. People bought cereal for the cartoon tiger, detergent because of the clean-looking housewife on the box, and cigarettes because, well, the Marlboro Man had a horse. So in this atmosphere of optimism and borderline manipulation, Sealed Air had a golden opportunity to package their peculiar product not as trash but treasure. But selling air is harder than it sounds. Initially, most companies looked at bubble wrap and thought, this is what's going to protect our delicate, expensive equipment. It looked like something a kid would use to suffocate a Barbie. It was thin. It was plastic. It popped. Surely no executive in a pinstripe suit was going to be sold on air cushions. And yet they were. The genius of Sealed Air's early marketing lay in its simplicity. They didn't just say this material protects your goods. They said it prevents catastrophic financial losses. It wasn't about bubble wrap being fun or squishy. It was a serious tool for serious people, doing serious things like shipping $10,000 computers that couldn't survive a sneeze, let alone a drop from a forklift. Their message was clean. You're not buying packaging. You're buying peace of mind. You're buying insurance. You're buying protection from lawsuits when your customer opens a box of shattered disappointment. And let's talk slogans. Sealed Air knew they were walking a fine line between practical and ridiculous. One early pitch revolved around cushioned transport reliability. Another played on the idea of miniature air cells providing maximum damage control. If those sound like they were written by an engineer, that's because they probably were. This was a time when the word technology had power, so bubble wrap wasn't just plastic, it was engineered packaging. But perhaps the real brilliance of Sealed Air's strategy was psychological. They created a demand for something you didn't know you needed, and they did it by reminding you of your worst nightmare, a broken product arriving on your customer's doorstep, a dented TV, a smashed printer, a shipment of shattered beakers. Okay, that one's niche, but still upsetting. That fear became their leverage. Packaging, up until then, was largely seen as a necessary evil. It was newspaper, cardboard, or styrofoam peanuts, which were messy, annoying, and inexplicably static charged to stick to everything except what you wanted protected. Bubble wrap? It was clean, it was light, it didn't make a mess, and crucially it worked. Now imagine the pitch meetings. Hi, we'd like to sell you air in plastic to protect your goods. It sounds like a joke, but then they'd run a demo. Drop a light bulb wrapped in their miracle material. Nothing breaks. Suddenly, selling air didn't sound so crazy. In fact, it sounded like the future. They targeted electronics manufacturers first. Those were the clients most terrified of breakage and least excited about insurance claims. But soon, bubble wrap spread to every corner of the shipping world. Cosmetics, glassware, musical instruments, even medical equipment. If it could be dropped, it could be wrapped. Of course, Sealed Air didn't stop at bubble wrap. They leaned into the idea of selling air with further innovations. Air pillows, inflatable mailers, foam-in-place systems. It turns out that once you convince the world that invisible, weightless, shapeless material is worth real money, the sky, or at least the warehouse ceiling, is the limit. And don't forget the price point. Bubble wrap was cheap to make and sold at a markup that would make oil companies blush. There's a reason Sealed Air became a packaging giant. They weren't just selling rolls of plastic, they were selling an idea. A layer of trust, a squishy, crinkly promise that your product would survive the journey. It's also the only product in history that could market itself both as a serious industrial tool and as fun to step on at parties. Try doing that with a steel crate. So yes, only in America can a company make a fortune selling air, twice. First to businesses, under the banner of industrial safety, then again to everyone else, as the world's most satisfying stress relief toy, all thanks to clever marketing, human anxiety, and just the right amount of pop. In the pantheon of accidental cultural icons, bubble wrap sits comfortably between the slinky and duct tape, a tool that was never meant to entertain us, and yet here we are gleefully popping plastic air pockets like it's a competitive sport. What began as a failed home decor project and then made a heroic pivot into the world of shipping logistics somehow went rogue. It became fun. Let's be clear, nobody designed bubble wrap to be a stress-relieving toy. That was an unintended side effect, like discovering chocolate also works as therapy, or that yelling into a pillow has genuine psychological benefits. But once people got a taste of that sweet, sweet pop, there was no going back. What started as packaging became a playground for the fingers, a therapy session for the soul, and a low-budget thrill ride you didn't even need to leave your desk for. By the late 20th century, bubble wrap had already solidified its place in the shipping industry. But something strange began happening. People were keeping the wrap, not to reuse it, but to pop it. Employees at tech companies were hoarding discarded wrap like pirates with treasure maps. Children would dig through boxes like mini-archaeologists, hunting for the sacred scroll of air-filled distraction. Adults, especially those in soul-crushing office jobs, found themselves hypnotized by the repetitive, oddly satisfying sound. The world had discovered a hidden superpower in this packaging material: emotional support. There was no turning back. It didn't take long for companies to realize they were sitting on a gold mine, not just of protective packaging, but of pure, unfiltered joy. Soon, toy manufacturers jumped on board. Products began emerging that sold bubble wrap specifically for the popping, with the wrapping being the gift itself. In the early 2000s, Japanese novelty companies began marketing small sheets of infinite pop bubble wrap. These weren't real bubbles, mind you. They were rubber buttons designed to simulate that euphoric pop without ever running out. It was like a fidget spinner with sound effects, and people loved it. One particular example, Bandai's Puchi Puchi, a handheld keychain with 8 infinite bubble poppers, sold millions in Japan. It even came with randomized sound effects to keep things interesting, because apparently the only thing better than popping fake bubbles is popping fake bubbles that occasionally shout cow. Just when you thought it couldn't get weirder, the internet stepped in. As early as the late 1990s, websites appeared that let you click your way across virtual sheets of bubble wrap. It was marketed as stress relief for office workers, and it worked. For a glorious 5 minutes, you could ignore your inbox, your boss, and your life decisions and just pop digital air pockets like a productivity fugitive. By the time smartphones entered the scene, bubble wrap apps began flooding the market. Some simulated the sound and feel with tactile vibrations. Others offered pop races, because what's more human than turning stress relief into a competition? Society had officially peaked. By now, bubble wrap was no longer just a behind-the-scenes hero. It was showing up in TV shows, commercials, and movies. Characters popped it absent-mindedly in the background, or used it as a comedic prop. It became visual shorthand for stress, distraction, and low-budget fun. You knew a character was anxious or spiraling when they reached for the bubble wrap instead of alcohol. Bubble wrap's appeal knows no age or species. For toddlers, it's a sensory experience. For cats, it's a toy that fights back. Videos of pets battling bubble wrap went viral, as did clips of people laying entire sheets across the floor and walking on them like stress relief bubble mats. Someone even invented a bubble wrap dance floor, which is either brilliant or a lawsuit waiting to happen. And let's not forget its role in pranks. Wrapping a roommate's entire room in bubble wrap? Hilarious. Putting it under someone's rug to simulate spontaneous haunting noises? Genius. lining your co-worker's chair with it so they sound like they're sitting on a bowl of Rice Krispies? You, my friend, are an office legend. What makes it all so irresistible? Scientists have actually studied this. The act of popping bubble wrap releases small bursts of dopamine, a reward chemical in the brain. It's repetitive, sensory, and gives a feeling of control in an increasingly chaotic world. In short, bubble wrap gives us the illusion of progress, one satisfying pop at a time. Psychologists even recommend it for anxiety and ADHD. Occupational therapists use it for sensory stimulation. There's something universally appealing about doing something pointless but delightful. It's tactile therapy, no copay required. Bubble wrap wasn't supposed to be fun, it was supposed to be wallpaper. Then insulation, then packaging. But along the way it evolved into something far more powerful, a cultural symbol of whimsy, absurdity, and the basic human desire to destroy something that can't fight back. It's the only invention that can protect a $5,000 laptop and also entertain a bored intern. And that, friends, is the magic of the pop. There's a moment, pure, unfiltered bliss that occurs when you press your thumb and index finger against a small plastic dome and hear it go pop. That tiny sound, barely louder than a whisper, has echoed through classrooms, cubicles, and living rooms across the globe. And while bubble wrap's origins are squarely rooted in the packaging world, its emotional afterlife is something else entirely. A kind of low-budget, highly tactile therapy session that doesn't ask about your childhood or charge by the hour. So why is it that millions of people can't help but squeeze the life out of these plastic pustules? Is it just a satisfying sound? Or are our brains hardwired to love popping things? Turns out, science has some thoughts, and for once they're kind of fun. Let's begin with the simple truth. Popping bubble wrap feels good. The sensation is a delightful combination of light resistance and sudden release. It's just enough tension to feel like you're doing something, but not so much that it takes effort. You squeeze and snap, a result. Your action has consequences, albeit tiny, satisfying ones. This is known in the psychological world as sensory feedback, and humans are absolutely addicted to it. It's why we click pens when we're thinking, crack knuckles out of boredom, or compulsively tap our feet during meetings that should have been emails. We're wired to enjoy small, repetitive motions with immediate payoff. In fact, researchers have looked into the bubble wrap effect because of course they have. A 1992 study at the University of Surrey in the UK found that people who were given sheets of bubble wrap to pop during stressful tasks reported significantly lower stress levels than those who didn't. They even described themselves as more alert and relaxed afterward. That's right, popping plastic bubbles not only improves your mood, but it might just keep you from falling asleep during your 2 p.m. Zoom call. It also gives us a sense of control, something that's hard to come by in the chaos of modern life. The world may be on fire metaphorically and sometimes literally, but here's a tiny globe you can conquer with your thumbs. One bubble at a time. You choose the pace. You choose the pattern. You choose how many you'll save for later, even though you know full well you'll pop them all before lunch. But the joy doesn't stop at psychology. It's practically sociological. Bubble wrap has become a communal experience. Office workers have been known to hide it in co-workers' drawers for an ambush pop. Teachers hand it out during exam week like a budget substitute for emotional support animals. Students use it to distract themselves from the soul-draining abyss that is group work. Entire Reddit threads exist solely to discuss pop techniques, including the single squeeze, the roll and crunch, and the slightly terrifying whole sheet stomp. There's also the tactile universality of it. Unlike a lot of stress relievers, bubble wrap doesn't require instructions, age limits, or assembly. You don't need to download anything. There's no onboarding. It's just you, some air pockets, and an ancient part of your brain going, yes, more of this. And let's not forget the economic accessibility of it. While stress balls can cost money, meditation apps want subscriptions, and fidget toys look like rejected transformers, bubble wrap often shows up free, tucked inside packages you were already going to open. In a way, it's like capitalism handing you a little peace offering with every overpriced online purchase. Sure, you didn't need this Bluetooth mug warmer, it whispers, but here's a dopamine sheet for your troubles. Over time, its therapeutic reputation grew so strong that companies began marketing bubble wrap specifically for stress relief. You could buy small pocket pop keychains. There were calendars made entirely of bubble wrap, where each day was a pop away. And then, of course, came the apps. Virtual bubble wrap for your phone, complete with lifelike sound effects. Did it feel the same? Not quite. But for some, it was enough. For others, it was just a gateway until they could get their next real fix. There's even a bubble wrap appreciation day, celebrated the last Monday of every January. It began in Indiana after a radio station received a shipment of microphones wrapped in bubble wrap and decided to turn it into an on-air popping fest. Since then, the tradition has spread in a joyful, crinkly, stress-relieving wave. So when you're having one of those days, your inbox is overflowing, your brain is buffering and your Zoom camera just froze mid-yawn, there's no shame in reaching for the wrap. In fact, it might be the smartest therapy move you make all week. No paperwork, no awkward silences, just pop, 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 and suddenly, everything feels a little more manageable, because in a world where problems can't always be fixed and stress never really ends, at least some things still go pop when you squeeze them just right. Bubble wrap may have been born in the suburban labs of mid-century America, but like any truly great cultural icon, it didn't take long to go global. What began as a glorified plastic mistake turned household necessity now finds itself wrapped quite literally around the world. From shipping centers in Shanghai to quirky art studios in Berlin, bubble wrap has transcended its humble roots. It's no longer just a packaging material. It's an international phenomenon, with the passport stamps to prove it. Let's start with the obvious, shipping. You can't send a ceramic llama from Peru to Portugal without ensuring it survives the journey unscathed. Enter bubble wrap. Its squishy armor has become the universal go-to for international freight, domestic deliveries, and your cousin's regrettable Etsy shop. Whether it's cushioning electronics in Tokyo or swaddling fragile figurines in Cairo, bubble wrap speaks the language of protection. No translation needed. But shipping isn't where the story ends. In fact, it's where things start to get weird and delightfully so. Take, for instance, South Korea. There, bubble wrap isn't just a tool, it's a muse. Artists have embraced it as a medium, turning air pockets into intricate sculptures and surrealist canvases. Forget oil paints. In Seoul's underground art scene, it's all about the hiss and pop of creative rebellion. There's even a performance artist who wraps themselves in bubble wrap and rolls down hills to symbolize consumerist excess. Interpret that as you will. Meanwhile, in Japan, the land where vending machines dispense everything from ramen to existential crisis, bubble wrap has taken on a life of its own. Enter Puchi Puchi, a wildly popular handheld toy invented to mimic the endless joy of popping bubbles. It never runs out, it never judges. It just pops on command, like a loyal plastic friend. The device comes with sound effects and even offers random bonus sounds like a dog bark or a doorbell. Because why not? And then there's Bubble Wrap Appreciation Day. No, that's not a typo. The last Monday of every January is reserved for humanity to honor the squishy savior of fragile goods. It all began in Indiana in 2001 when a radio station received a box of microphones cushioned in bubble wrap. Naturally, they started popping it on air. Listeners joined in. A tradition was born. Now schools have themed activities, libraries host popping competitions, and workplaces host stress pop sessions, which is like therapy, only with more satisfying sound effects. The UK has also joined the Bubble Brigade with its own eccentric flair. British novelty shops sell bubble wrap suits. Yes, wearable armor for the perpetually anxious. Great for stress relief, less so for navigating narrow staircases. Meanwhile, artists have used it to line entire gallery spaces, inviting visitors to experience a room where the floor, walls, and ceiling are all poppable. It's part installation, part stress test, and entirely British. Even the fashion industry has taken a jab at bubble couture. In Milan and Paris, where fashion is serious business and models somehow survive on espresso and existential dread, bubble wrap has graced catwalks as avant-garde gowns. Designers have turned it into puffed sleeves, billowy dresses, and high-concept headwear. Functional? No. Fabulous? Absolutely. It's the only dress that lets you decompress between runway poses. In the manufacturing sector, particularly in Germany and China, innovation is the name of the game. Here, bubble wrap is no longer just clear and squeaky, it's been upgraded. Giant bubble wrap with air pockets the size of baseballs is used for heavy-duty industrial goods. Meanwhile, small bubble versions are optimized for tiny electronics. Colored bubble wrap, scented versions, anti-static varieties, and biodegradable lines have all entered the chat. There's even bubble wrap that glows in the dark for those shipping emergencies at 3 a.m. And then there's the green revolution, as environmental awareness grows louder than a sheet of full bubbles underfoot. So too has the demand for sustainable alternatives. Eco-conscious companies have started producing biodegradable bubble wrap made from recycled materials or even cornstarch-based plastics. Some inventive startups are offering wrapless shipping tech, reusable AirPod systems that mimic bubble wrap's properties while reducing plastic waste. The message? Bubble responsibly. What makes bubble wrap so beloved worldwide isn't just its practicality, it's its versatility. It protects, it entertains, it inspires. Whether it's cushioning your grandmother's heirloom or giving a bored office worker 5 minutes of pure joy, bubble wrap has become a universal language of comfort. It tells us, I've got you covered, literally. And let's be honest, if there's an international day for toast, selfies, or talking like a pirate, then bubble wrap, the unsung hero of global logistics and late-night stress relief, absolutely deserves its moment in the spotlight. There comes a time in every beloved invention's life when it has to grow up, mature, and in bubble wrap's case, face the existential crisis of becoming quiet. Yes, we've entered an era where the very soul of bubble wrap is being threatened. Not because it doesn't work, but because it might be too joyful. Let's talk about the popless plague, eco-innovations, and how the most satisfying sound in shipping history is having to justify its continued existence. Once upon a time, bubble wrap was untouchable, until you touched it, and then promptly popped it. But then came the demands of environmental responsibility, cost-saving logistics, and perhaps most tragically, Amazon's decision to replace real bubble wrap with something that resembles air pillows filled with corporate disappointment. This moment, for many, marked the beginning of what internet users now refer to, only half-jokingly, as the Great Silence. You see, traditional bubble wrap, made of non-biodegradable polyethylene plastic, isn't exactly best friends with Mother Earth. The growing awareness of plastic pollution pushed many companies to seek alternatives. Enter the realm of recyclable, compostable, biodegradable, and frankly unfun options. New forms of packaging include mushroom-based foam, corrugated paper padding, and inflatable plastic pillows that might cushion your item but never your soul. And then there's the cruelest invention of them all, sealed air wrap that doesn't pop. This Frankenstein's monster of modern logistics looks like bubble wrap, feels like bubble wrap, but has one fatal flaw. It's made in long interconnected sheets, so that pressing one bubble just pushes the air to the next. The result? No satisfying pop. It's like biting into what you thought was a chocolate chip cookie and discovering it's raisin. Betrayal in plastic form. The reason behind this unholy development? Cost and efficiency. This popless version is easier to produce, more compact to ship, and can be inflated on-site in warehouses, saving space and money. In the cold, calculating world of global e-commerce, joy is rarely factored into the packaging budget, but all is not lost. In the same way vinyl records made a comeback, the classic poppable wrap has its die-hard fans. Some niche sellers market it specifically for sensory stress relief, even as a luxury wrapping choice. There are even companies producing eco-friendly versions of traditional bubble wrap, using biodegradable or recycled plastics because apparently you can have your pop and not ruin the planet too. At the same time, E-commerce has never depended more on protective packaging. With the explosive rise in online shopping, there's a global army of cardboard boxes marching across the world, and most of them are carrying precious contents ranging from electronics to that third pair of identical black leggings someone swore they didn't already own. Bubble wrap and its quieter cousins are still doing the frontline work of making sure those items arrive intact, even if the unboxing experience no longer includes a symphony of satisfying snaps. The real question is, where do we go from here? Could there be a biodegradable wrap that pops and composts itself in your garden? Will someone invent reusable bubble wrap with a reset button so you can pop forever? Or will society descend into chaos, fueled by years of pent-up, unpopped frustration? In a world increasingly dominated by silent efficiency and muted convenience, the future of bubble wrap might just depend on those who fight for fun. Because while sustainability is essential, so is whimsy. And if there's one thing the world needs more of, it's a little joy that comes from squeezing a bit of air until it makes a tiny, defiant sound of rebellion. So here's to the future. May it be green, may it be sustainable, and may it still go pop. Bubble wrap was never supposed to be famous. It was supposed to be wallpaper. Yes, wallpaper. That fact alone should tell you everything you need to know about how weird and wonderful innovation history really is. Two inventors, trying to make textured wall coverings for the modern mid-century home, accidentally created a global phenomenon that would end up protecting electronics, soothing stressed-out fingers and earning its own national holiday. Not bad for something that's basically just tiny plastic pillows of air. It began, as many glorious accidents do, with a misfire. Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavans weren't aiming for packaging materials when they trapped air between two shower curtains. They imagined chic interiors, groovy homes, and a texture trend that would rival shag carpet. The world, however, wasn't quite ready for that level of vinyl-on-wall ambition. The product flopped, spectacularly. But this is where the legacy of bubble wrap begins to shine. Not because it failed, but because it pivoted. When IBM needed something to cushion their brand new computers during shipping in the 1960s, bubble wrap stepped out of the shadows and into the logistics limelight, from flop to function in one corporate phone call. Since then, it has become more than just packaging. It's a sensory object, a cultural reference, and for many, a personal therapy tool. It's been used in art exhibits, stress relief toys, and even formal wear. Yes, bubble wrap wedding dresses are a thing because of course they are. It even got its own official day of recognition, Bubble Wrap Appreciation Day, held on the last Monday of January. This is the kind of honor not even fax machines or the guy who invented the bread clip can boast. But perhaps bubble wrap's greatest legacy is what it represents, the beauty of the unexpected. It reminds us that accidents aren't always setbacks, they can be springboards. Some of history's greatest innovations started as Plan B or Plan Z. Penicillin came from a messy lab. The microwave, a melted candy bar. Post-it notes were the result of a glue that didn't glue very well. And bubble wrap, a decorating fail that became the soundtrack of shipping success. There's something oddly poetic about its design too. It's protective yet fragile. It's fun but fleeting. It's full of air, yet somehow deeply satisfying. In that way, it's kind of the perfect metaphor for modern life. We wrap ourselves in buffers, emotional, physical, digital, to soften the blows. And just like bubble wrap, sometimes those buffers are popped, deflated, or stepped on by mistake. But that's life. Loud, delicate, absurdly padded. The sound of a bubble popping is in its own tiny way a universal language. It crosses cultural lines, age barriers, and economic divides. A CEO, a kindergartner, and your dog might all find equal joy in squishing one bubble just right. That's rare, that's legacy. And perhaps in the end, bubble wrap's true triumph isn't just in how many items it's protected, but in how many smiles it's produced along the way. It's a symbol of innovation that doesn't take itself too seriously, of success born from failure, of packaging that became the present. So the next time you hear that small, satisfying pop, take a moment to remember, This wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't the plan, but it worked gloriously. In the end, bubble wrap taught us one thing: even if your dreams burst, someone might still pay to hear it happen. Before the glory of handheld dryers and fancy diffusers, there was towel friction, open flames, and a whole lot of praying for sun. Drying your hair in the pre-electricity era wasn't a beauty routine. It was a slow, soggy test of patience and lung capacity, for all the huffing and puffing you did, trying to get it dry before nightfall. For most of human history, if you wanted to get your hair dry, you had two options: wait or get creative, sometimes dangerously creative. In a time when heating systems were just fireplaces and your best styling product was probably pig lard, managing wet hair wasn't about vanity, it was about survival. And not in a dramatic "my bangs don't look right" kind of way. We're talking full-on Victorian fear-mongering: don't go to bed with wet hair or you'll die, or worse, become unfashionable. Victorian-era mothers didn't just warn their children about damp heads, they were practically haunted by them. The prevailing belief was that wet hair meant open pores, and open pores were apparently gateways for every disease known to mankind. Colds, flus, fevers, consumption, hysteria, you name it. And someone blamed it on your poor towel drying technique. To make matters worse, hair washing wasn't a daily or even weekly activity for most. A good hair scrub might happen once a month, maybe twice if you were feeling fancy. So drying it properly was a rare, high-stakes event. But let's say you were one of those daring individuals who washed your hair with actual water more than twice a season. What then? If you were wealthy, you might have access to a servant wielding a hand fan, tirelessly wafting air toward your scalp for hours while you sat in a dressing gown, wondering if this is what luxury was supposed to feel like. If you were middle class, you might sit near the stove or fireplace, which introduced the very real risk of burning your eyebrows off in pursuit of dry locks. Women would often hover near open flames with their heads bent forward, hoping to catch a draft of warm air without igniting the lace trim on their nightcaps. If you were a true innovator, or just had questionable judgment, you might try attaching a metal funnel to the stovepipe to direct warm air onto your head. Great in theory. In practice, well, it was a miracle if your scalp survived intact. Improvised tools like bellows were also used, blowing warm and sometimes sooty air directly into hair in a scene that could be mistaken for a medieval exorcism. Others tried using heated combs and brushes, which worked fine until they overheated and left their mark literally. And let's not forget the towel method, still popular today in a much less aggressive form, but in the past, towels were coarser and less absorbent, so drying your hair meant a lot of rubbing, wringing, twisting, and possibly damaging several generations of split ends. Victorian women were known for wrapping their long hair in these primitive towels and pacing near the fireplace like damp ghosts, hoping the combined efforts of cloth and heat would eventually triumph. Even by the early 20th century, there was no consensus on how best to dry hair. Articles in beauty magazines suggested absurd timelines. Allow your hair to dry naturally for at least 6 hours before styling. 6 hours? That's not a routine. That's a hostage situation. Some women would even sleep sitting up so their hair wouldn't be crushed or remain damp on the pillow. Comfort, as it turns out, was not a major factor in beauty back then. Vanity was often paired with mild suffering, a tradition we still cling to with heat styling tools and eyelash glue. The sheer effort that went into drying hair in the pre-dryer era gives us a better appreciation for modern conveniences. You didn't just do your hair, you endured it. There were no blowouts, no wash-and-go routines. It was more of a wash, dry for an eternity, get smoke in your face, and possibly catch pneumonia kind of lifestyle. And while many of today's stylists speak reverently about air drying for natural texture, they conveniently forget the historic trauma of actually having no other option. No volume mousse, no heat protectant, no hair straighteners, just you, your soaking strands, and the distant smell of burning wood. If you were lucky, you ended up with hair that was only mildly frizzy and a forehead that still had its eyebrows. So next time you pick up your sleek, dual-speed, tourmaline-infused, ionic blast hairdryer and complain about how long it takes, remember, not that long ago your best bet was to stand in the wind and hope for the best. Before the modern blow-dryer became a standard bathroom companion right next to your toothpaste and existential dread, it had to crawl, no, clunk through a very noisy, very unsafe infancy. And it all began with a man who clearly decided that if women were going to dry their hair, they should do it while looking like they were being prepared for launch. Enter Alexandre Ferdinand Godefroy and his fire-belching, gas-hissing metal monstrosity. The year was 1890. France, ever the epicenter of fashion innovation and slightly alarming beauty trends, became the birthplace of the hairdryer. But this was no sleek, palm-sized device. No. Godefroy's hair-drying apparatus looked like it belonged in a mad scientist basement next to the Tesla coil and a suspicious number of live frogs. The machine wasn't even technically drying hair, so much as it was daring women to sit very still while hot air powered by gas was funneled through a metal hose into an overhead dome. This wasn't some accidental DIY gone rogue. This was intentional. Godefroy ran a salon. And like any good entrepreneur, he wanted to make his clients' experience faster, more effective, and apparently a little more terrifying. The machine worked by connecting a seated person to a heat source via a hooded tube contraption that covered their head. It was sort of like standing under a jet engine if the engine had anxiety and smelled faintly of gas leaks. Comfort, optional. Portability, not even in the realm of possibility. Godefroy's dryer was the size of a small armoire, and anchored to a salon chair like a stubborn relative who just wouldn't leave. It didn't move. It didn't hum. It growled. And if you wanted your hair dried in under 3 hours, you had to be okay with the occasional scorched ear or mild forehead perspiration that could double as a steam facial. Let's also remember this was the 1890s. People were still coming to terms with the idea that electricity wasn't black magic. So when a giant hose started blasting hot air into a woman's delicate Victorian updo, it must have felt more like a séance than a salon visit. It wasn't uncommon for early users to report burns, dizziness, or a general feeling that they had entered a machine designed for psychological warfare. There was also the matter of safety, or the thrilling lack thereof. The device was powered by gas, which, if history has taught us anything, is a great way to light a stove or end up on fire. There were no temperature controls, no emergency shutoffs, and certainly no instruction manual with smiley faces and warnings like, don't operate near water or during emotional breakdowns. If anything, using it required the same kind of courage one needed to ride a roller coaster made out of matchsticks. Despite all this, the invention gained traction because, let's face it, beauty has always been a little masochistic. Godefroy's hairdryer became a fixture in upscale European salons, where women could sit under the mechanical monster and pretend that having their scalps slow roasted was simply the cost of elegance. Meanwhile, salon owners likely counted their blessings every time no one burst into flames. What made this all the more fascinating was that the Godefroy dryer was part of a wider movement in the late 19th century, turning grooming into a mechanized, electrified industrial process. Just as barbers began wielding clippers that buzzed like angry bees, salons began looking like factory floors with more curls and fewer labor unions. Godefroy's invention fit right in, heralding the arrival of a future where hairstyling would no longer rely solely on sun, time, or the collective effort of 12 handmaidens with towels. And yet, for all its faults, and there were many, Godefroy's contraption did one crucial thing. It showed the world that drying hair faster was possible. Sure, it was the equivalent of using a flamethrower to toast bread, but it worked. And like many great inventions, it didn't start pretty. It started with a loud bang, a lot of trial and error, and an unshakable belief that no one should have to wait 5 hours for their bangs to dry. So the next time you casually flip on your sleek ceramic tourmaline dryer with multiple settings and ionic technology, spare a thought for the brave women of the Belle Epoque. They sat under a hulking metal contraption, risked their eyebrows, and sweated it out, all so you could dry your hair while checking your phone and complaining that it's taking too long. If you've ever complained about how long it takes to dry your hair in the morning, allow us to take you on a quick trip back to the 1920s, where salon visits were part beauty treatment, part bravery exercise. Gone were the days of fireplace singeing and fan-flapping desperation. The new kid on the block was the hood dryer, a salon-sized behemoth that looked less like a beauty appliance and more like something salvaged from the cockpit of a doomed Zeppelin. These weren't your compact, handheld gadgets with ionic options and cool air buttons. No, the 1920s hair-drying experience was what you'd get if a popcorn machine married a diving bell and decided to pursue a career in cosmetology. The massive dome-shaped devices were installed in the corners of salons and were hooked up to hulking motors that roared like an over-caffeinated tractor. The general principle: trap your head in a hot air bubble and hope for the best. At the heart of these early salon dryers was a very optimistic understanding of temperature regulation. Women sat beneath these space-age bonnets for hours, enduring a relentless stream of warm and sometimes not-so-warm air. The dryers were notoriously inconsistent, one moment gently drying your curls, the next flash-frying your bangs. If your stylist wasn't paying attention, you might leave the salon with the latest flapper bob, entirely by accident. The idea was simple: dry large quantities of hair more efficiently and simultaneously make women feel like test subjects at a NASA training facility. But simplicity in theory didn't always equal comfort in practice. Early machines often overheated, as the air was pumped into the helmet via motors that had a personal vendetta against thermostats. Since many salons didn't yet have air conditioning, the result was a kind of DIY Finnish sauna strapped to your scalp. Hair salons in this era weren't just places to get your hair done, they were endurance chambers. Women brought magazines, snacks, and occasionally small flasks to survive the long drying sessions. There are stories not apocryphal of clients emerging with third-degree burns, crispy roots, or in the most unfortunate cases, scorched ears. Still, they kept coming back. Why? Because sleek, dry hair was the new social currency, and no one wanted to be caught in public with damp ringlets and the scent of towel mildew. Naturally, these dryers weren't without their electrical flair. Sparks flying? A normal Tuesday. Strange humming noises? Business as usual. A sudden puff of smoke accompanied by the acrid tang of fried wiring. Probably just Mildred in chair 4 achieving a new level of follicular enlightenment. And yet, amidst the occasional puff of ozone and the occasional fire drill, these monstrosities represented a major leap forward in hair care. For the first time, drying hair wasn't just about utility. It was a social ritual, an event, a glamorous ordeal. The helmet dryers also brought a strange kind of community. Rows of women sitting side by side, faces buried in magazines, heads encased in chrome domes that looked like miniature moonlanders. They'd gossip, share beauty tips, and occasionally scream if someone's dryer made a noise resembling a death rattle. It was bonding through peril, sisterhood, forged in the fires of forced hot air. By the late 1920s, these dryers were a staple in salons across Europe and the United States. Manufacturers began competing to make them sleeker, rid slightly less terrifying and more efficient, rid slightly less prone to combustion. There were claims of built-in timers, temperature controls, and even beauty-enhancing rays, because nothing sells a product like adding the word ray to it. Despite their flaws, these helmet dryers were an essential step in the evolution of hair technology. They proved that drying could be done en masse, that clients were willing to trade comfort for speed, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, could stand between a woman and a good hair day, not even mild electrocution. And so, even as we look back at these clunky chrome monsters with a mix of awe and mild horror, we owe them credit. They brought a strange kind of progress, one pop and sizzle at a time. If the 1920s gave us salon dryers that looked like crash helmets designed by Jules Verne, then the 1930s and 1940s promised liberation, freedom from the chrome domes, the hours-long roasting sessions, and the need to sign a waiver before every hair appointment. Enter the handheld hairdryer, a miracle of modern invention, a triumph of portability, a small metallic bomb waiting to detonate in your palm. The early handheld electric dryers were a classic case of good idea, questionable execution. They were touted in advertisements as lightweight, easy to use, and perfect for home styling. In reality, they were only technically handheld, in the same way that a live firework is technically portable. Most weighed in at around 1 to 2 kilograms, that's roughly the size of a baby raccoon, had metal casings that doubled as heat conductors, and ran on a charmingly unstable 400 to 500 watts of electrical enthusiasm. They buzzed, they rattled, they shrieked like a blender trying to process gravel, and they heated up fast, not just the air, but the device itself. Gripping the handle for more than 10 minutes was like volunteering to palm a curling iron. Beauty magazines of the time offered helpful tips like wrap the handle in a tea towel and switch hands every 2 minutes to prevent nerve damage. Hand cramps were part of the styling experience, and so were minor burns if your fingers wandered too close to the motor vents. The wires, oh the wires, coated in cloth or thin rubber, these cords had the lifespan of a wet shoelace. They frayed, they sparked, they got alarmingly warm. Sometimes they smoked, and since many homes still had questionable wiring and no ground fault interrupters, using your dryer next to a sink was not just risky, it was a casual brush with mortality. It's no wonder that beauty manuals of the era sternly warned, do not use near water, or pets, or feelings, because emotions might just be conductive. Yet, despite the risks, or perhaps because danger was part of the glamour, the handheld dryer became wildly popular. It was an aspirational appliance. Owning one said you were modern, sophisticated, and willing to risk electrocution for volume. Models with names like the Princess and the Speedette promised salon results in your very own bathroom, though achieving them often required Olympic-level wrist strength and an iron constitution. Designs varied wildly. Some had pistol grips, others had vertical handles that made them resemble miniature vacuum cleaners. All were loud, not just loud in the sense of a hairdryer, but mechanically aggressive, like a small tank trapped in a tin can. Many didn't even have multiple heat settings. It was either blast furnace or off. 1 minute your hair was damp, and the next, it was a steaming pile of regret. The motors were crude by today's standards, often repurposed from electric fans or small machinery. Airflow was spotty. Sometimes it blew strong enough to rearrange your bathroom decor, and sometimes it wheezed like a Victorian ghost. But it was your Victorian ghost, and it meant you could dry your hair without leaving the house, which made it worth every near-death experience. These dryers also introduced a whole new domestic drama, drying your hair while balancing on one foot, rotating your head like a rotisserie chicken, all while trying not to yank the short cord out of the wall. There were no diffusers, no cool shots, no ceramic tourmaline iron nanofusion technology. There was just heat, wind and willpower. Still, to their credit, these handhelds marked a seismic shift. They put the power of styling into the hands of everyday people. No longer reliant on weekly salon visits or medieval contraptions, women could now control their own hair schedules, albeit with a healthy side of adrenaline. Beauty became less of a public spectacle and more of a private experiment in not catching fire. By the end of the 1940s, manufacturers began to prioritize safety, mostly, introducing models with improved wiring, plastic casing, hallelujah, and multiple settings. But the legacy of those early machines endured. They were loud, they were heavy, and they were borderline illegal by today's electrical standards. But they were also revolutionary, because what says progress more than risking your life for a good blowout? By the 1950s, America had emerged from the soot and struggle of World War II and entered the pastel-tinted fantasy of suburban life. The houses had picket fences, the kitchens had refrigerators that weren't the size of bathtubs, and the bathrooms, they were becoming ground zero for the beauty revolution, now featuring a brand new cast member, the home hair dryer. Hair dryers in the 1950s weren't just tools, they were trophies. Housewives, previously limited to salon visits or air drying under the wrath of ceiling fans, were now given the holy grail of personal grooming power. Specifically 1,000 watts of it, funneled through a molded plastic nozzle and aimed directly at the scalp like a very determined hair dragon. Advertisements promised transformation. "Look radiant in minutes," Ud chirped one ad, featuring a woman smiling in pearls while pointing what looked suspiciously like a plastic megaphone at her head. There were slogans that bordered on poetry. Beauty is a breeze with a breeze in your beauty routine. It was less about hair and more about freedom. Freedom to style yourself at home without risking third-degree burns from a stovetop or terrifying salon devices. The early home models were still intimidating, but noticeably less like military hardware. No more iron-cast beasts that sparked like they were auditioning for Frankenstein's lab. The new wave of dryers came in delicate pastels, soft mint green, blush pink, butter yellow shades that whispered domestic goddess instead of run for cover. These dryers were still not exactly ergonomic marvels. They often weighed more than a newborn, required 2 hands to aim properly, and got warm enough to double as a makeshift space heater in winter. The good news, the plastic casing didn't conduct heat like the older metal models. The bad news, the motors inside still did, and if you blocked the back vent, say by accidentally brushing it against your dressing gown, the dryer would heat up like a grudge. The 1950s were all about efficiency, wash-and-wear dresses, press-button toasters, dads in suits who read newspapers larger than their children. The hairdryer, too, promised speed and simplicity. No more soggy scalps, claimed one popular home appliance catalogue. And sure, that was mostly true unless you owned one of the many models that wheezed out lukewarm air like a smoker trying to blow out birthday candles. To supplement the low power of some models, companies introduced the bonnet dryer. These contraptions looked like a shower cap attached to a vacuum hose, and they pumped warm air from a base unit into the bonnet, enveloping the wearer's hair like a heat balloon. You could dry your curls while reading a magazine or scolding your child. Truly modern living. Except, and this is important, these devices had no auto shutoff, meaning that if you nodded off in your lounger, you might wake up with hair drier than the Mojave Desert, or a melted bonnet fusing with your pillow. The 1950s were also the golden age of advertising, which meant every household appliance came with a promise of elegance, power, and impossible perfection. Hair dryers were no different. In magazines, radiant women were shown using dryers while their husbands stood by approvingly, because nothing says romance like shouting over the roar of a fan turbine. Some ad campaigns even sold the dryer as a kind of secret weapon. "He'll never guess how you do it," one tagline winked, as if the 12-pound humming spaceship in your hand was invisible. There were brochures that claimed earnestly that a warm blast a day keeps frizz away. They also helpfully included diagrams on proper technique, aim downward for smoothness, never toward your ears, and never near pets. Because yes, people apparently tried to dry their dogs with these, and the results? Hairless poodles and scorched eyebrows. Despite the optimism of advertising, the reality was a bit hotter, literally. Even with plastic casing, the internal wiring was still a work in progress. Stories of women burning their bangs, overheating their curlers, or accidentally lighting a tissue box on fire were not uncommon. In fact, the phrase "beauty hurts" became very real very fast. And yet, people didn't stop. They dried on. Because by the 1950s, the hairdryer wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of progress. You weren't just blow-drying your hair, you were engaging with modernity. You were keeping up with your neighbors. You were living proof that you didn't need a salon to be stylish. Just a little courage and a lot of noise. The 1950s home hairdryer brought glamour into the home, and possibly a few electrical fires. It marked a shift from professional-only beauty to DIY fabulousness. Yes, it was loud. Yes, it occasionally smelled like melting plastic. But it also meant independence, speed, and style on your own schedule. So, the next time your fancy ceramic ionic dryer makes a gentle purring noise and dries your hair in 5 minutes flat, spare a thought for your 1950s counterpart who did the same job with a machine that sounded like an aeroplane engine and could boil water on low, If the 1950s introduced hair dryers to the home, the 1960s and 70s strapped them in, blasted them to full throttle, and cranked the dial all the way to dangerously fabulous. This was the era of beehives, bouffants, and blowouts so monumental they cast actual shadows, and at the center of this follicular explosion, the hairdryer, now louder, hotter, and for the first time somewhat stylish. By the early 1960s, something magical happened in American living rooms and powder rooms alike. The humble hairdryer finally got a makeover. Gone were the clunky metallic fire hazards of previous decades. In their place came sleek plastic units that looked less like industrial equipment and more like something Barbie might own. They were pastel-colored, compact-ish, and featured innovative attachments like combs, diffusers, and directional nozzles that somehow all promised to make your life easier, while still mostly sounding like a rocket preparing for liftoff. But the real diva of this decade was the bonnet dryer. These marvels of mid-century ingenuity looked like someone had attached a wind tunnel to a shower cap. The user would sit patiently beneath a soft or hard plastic hood, which connected to a motorized base via a hose that pumped warm air directly over the head. The result? Salon-level styles without the need to leave your avocado-colored kitchen. Just plug it in, turn on the Lawrence Welk show, and sit quietly while your skull slowly rotated in its own convection oven. While bonnet dryers provided the kind of set-it-and-forget-it styling that suited the era's fascination with multitasking, they also came with quirks. For one, they made conversation nearly impossible. These things didn't whisper, they roared. You weren't chatting with your sister while setting your hair, you were shouting over a windstorm. And if you were lucky, only your hearing took a hit. Some of the cheaper models were known to overheat, melt their tubing, or, in the case of one unfortunate product recall, inflate like a balloon and detach from the user's head mid-dry. Yet, despite these hazards, women embraced these devices with glee. That's because hair in the 1960s wasn't just hair, it was architecture. Beehives stood proud and defiant, a tower of backcombed strength lacquered in hairspray and hope. You didn't just dry your hair, you sculpted it, teased it, and preserved it like a prized museum artifact. A good hairdryer became a trusted tool in your personal Cold War arsenal, ready to blast any frizz into submission. By the 1970s, the styles had shifted from stiff and sky-high to long and flowing. But the technology didn't sit still. Dryers got hotter, lighter, and slightly less likely to destroy your nerves or eyebrows. Some of the more advanced versions even started to include multiple speed settings and cool air options. A revelation. Now you could alternate between scorching gusts and mild breezes, something your scalp would be grateful for, assuming it still had nerve endings. These decades also marked a sharp turn in advertising. In earlier years, hair dryers were often presented as utilitarian tools necessary for modern womanhood. Yes, but not exactly thrilling. Now the marketing turned aspirational. Advertisements promised not just dry hair, but freedom, glamour, and empowerment. Dry and style like the stars, one ad cooed, showing a woman reclining effortlessly, with a soft bonnet inflated around her head like she was preparing for a lunar mission to Fabulousville. It was a perfect storm of consumerism and vanity. Buy this device, plug it in, and become a goddess. Of course, this era also marked the beginning of another long-standing issue: electricity bills. These dryers, especially the high-powered home models, were not known for energy efficiency. Drying your hair daily could easily be the most power-hungry activity in your household, second only to running a refrigerator full of Jell-O molds. Still, no one seemed to mind. After all, what's a little financial burden in exchange for achieving hair so big it needed its own zip code? As with many things from the 60s and 70s, the hairdryer of this time was all about excess. More heat, more volume, more accessories, more risk. It wasn't a tool, it was a lifestyle. And while future decades would bring quieter motors, better safety standards, and styles that didn't require scaffolding, this was the golden age of blow-dried bravado. By the time the 1980s arrived, hairdryers had been through a full identity crisis, and were finally starting to resemble something that wouldn't terrify small children or require a fire marshal on standby. After decades of weapon-grade wattage and styles that leaned more toward post-apocalyptic dental tool than beauty appliance, the humble hairdryer began its transition into a sleek, consumer-friendly gadget. It didn't just dry your hair anymore, it cared for it, whispered softly with variable speed settings, and maybe even had a crush on your bangs. First on the docket, safety. After years of appliance horror stories involving frizzed wiring, hot handles and the occasional electrocution, regulatory agencies finally raised an eyebrow. Hairdryers were no longer just fast-track tickets to third-degree burns. They had to meet actual electrical safety standards. In parallel, the materials got smarter. Instead of molten metal shells that could double as medieval weaponry, manufacturers turned to lightweight, heat-resistant plastics. This meant the average consumer could actually hold the thing without feeling like they were weight training or preparing to arm wrestle a car engine. Ergonomic handles were introduced, which was code for your wrist won't dislocate halfway through drying your bangs. No longer did beauty require the upper body strength of a lumberjack. And then there were the bells and whistles, or in this case, the cool shots and heat settings. The cool shot button entered the scene, and though it often felt like someone exhaling tepid disappointment, it was a revelation for locking in styles. No longer did your blowout have to collapse the second you stepped outside. The cool shot was your hair's way of saying, I'm here, I'm styled, and I'm chilled to perfection. Technological sophistication escalated quickly. Ionic drying emerged, promising to use negatively charged ions to break up water molecules faster and reduce frizz. Now, whether or not those ions were truly miraculous or just marketing smoke and mirrors is still debated in hushed tones at salon conferences. But one thing was clear, hairdryers had gone from brute force hot air to tiny particle alchemy. Your hair could be smoother, shinier, and somehow morally superior, and that was just from pressing a button labeled "Ion." The rise of ceramic and tourmaline components meant hair wasn't just being blasted with heat, it was receiving a gentle spa-grade bake. Ceramic helped maintain even heat distribution, so one patch of your hair wouldn't resemble straw, while the other looked like it had been laminated. Tourmaline, a crushed gemstone apparently recruited from a wizard's pocket, also promised a sleeker finish. Who knew your morning hair routine now involved mineral science? And let's not forget the celebrity endorsements. By the late 90s, hairdryers were no longer just tools, they were glamour accessories. You had actresses whispering seductively into commercials about airflow direction and models gazing longingly at diffusers as if they were staring into the soul of a trusted lover. The devices had names like Turbo Styler 3000 or Volumax Ionizer Supreme, which sounded less like beauty tools and more like rejected superhero names, but people bought in. Suddenly, your hairdryer wasn't just something you used, it was something you chose. Hair itself had also been climbing new architectural heights throughout the 80s. Volume wasn't just encouraged, it was worshipped. The bigger the hair, the closer to someone's satellite dish. And these new, improved dryers were ready. They powered through mousse and aquanet, sculpting gravity-defying coiffes that could endure an entire day's worth of wind tunnels or family reunions. The 1990s toned it down a notch, favoring sleeker styles, but dryers adapted yet again, now with attachments, diffusers for curls, concentrators for straightening. The Swiss Army knives of hair care had arrived, and then came the color coding. By the 2000s, hair dryers came in every hue from soft lavender to neon rage. You didn't just own a hairdryer, you had a statement piece, one that matched your bathroom tiles, your personality, or the exact shade of lip gloss you wore on Tuesdays. It was sleek, chic, and plugged into your self-image as easily as it did the wall. But for all their polish, these dryers never forgot their roots. You could still smell the occasional overheated motor. The plastic still vibrated just a little too much, and the cool shot still occasionally felt like your dryer was sighing in exhaustion. But compared to the roaring metal monsters of decades past, these were angelic whisperers of style. Next up, it's time to go from function to fashion as we head into the 2010s and beyond, where hair dryers start looking like they belong in art galleries and sound like they're about to achieve liftoff. Let's dry the future. Welcome to the golden age of hot air. After a century of crackling wires, melted carpets, scorched foreheads and styling rituals that looked like low-budget Frankenstein auditions, the hairdryer has finally entered its final form, a status symbol of silent power, sleek design, and enough high-tech wizardry to qualify as personal aviation equipment. Today's dryers don't just blow, they boast ceramic heating elements, ionic technology, intelligent sensors, and aerodynamic design curves that scream, "I may be for hair, but I could also land a capsule." This is not your grandmother's hooded monster or your mother's hand-scorching metal cannon. This is the Dyson era, where drying your bangs involves the same R&D budget as building a Mars rover. Let's begin with the headline act, the Dyson Supersonic. Launched in 2016 with the fanfare of a new iPhone and a price tag that could feed a family for a week, the Supersonic was the first hairdryer to look like it came out of a luxury bathroom. No visible blades, a hollow core, and a sound no louder than a polite exhale. It promised the impossible: dry your hair faster, quieter, and without frying it into something you'd only see in a 90s boy band reunion tour. The Supersonic wasn't just a product, it was a statement. It whispered quietly, of course, that you cared about your hair's health, your eardrums, and your bathroom's aesthetic. It also kicked off a design arms race, prompting competitors to release their own turbocharged, noise-reduced, ceramic-infused, nano-ionic lightsabers of follicular finesse. Brands like Shark, GHD, Zuvi, and T3 suddenly rolled out dryers that had more features than your car dashboard and occasionally the same price. These modern dryers now boast terms that would make a science teacher weep with joy: tourmaline-infused airflow, ionic conditioning, negative ions neutralizing static, moisture-sensing technology that adjusts the heat output mid-blow. It's less about drying your hair and more about participating in an intimate high-tech performance art piece. And yes, some of these dryers have cool air settings so precise they feel like the gentle breath of a unicorn. Others come with diffusers that look like spacecraft docking ports and concentrator nozzles engineered with the precision of laser-guided hair discipline. There are even smart dryers with built-in Wi-Fi, tracking how often you use them, just in case you needed a push notification to remind you your fringe is due for a blast. But of course, all this luxury doesn't come without a hint of absurdity, because for all the billions spent on innovation, you still get days where your hair laughs in the face of airflow, frizzes rebelliously, and dares your fancy dryer to do its worst. There's a reason the backup plan for many still involves a towel and a prayer. Then there's the silent revolution. Literally, in a market where silence sells, hair dryers have hushed down to the point where using one no longer sounds like a Boeing taking off in your ear canal. Parents can dry hair during nap time, roommates can coexist peacefully, and morning routines no longer require noise-cancelling headphones and a full-body clench. Celebrity endorsements have also evolved. Back in the day, it was a supermodel in a satin robe, pretending her scalp was in bliss while the fire hazard buzzed beside her. Today, it's influencers in softly lit bathrooms whispering into cameras about ionic flow control and shine-enhancing tech, while their hair floats in slow motion like it's trying to get into heaven. But let's not forget the elephant in the room, the price. Modern dryers can cost upwards of $500. For that amount, you could buy a plane ticket, start a side hustle, or, historically speaking, own an entire flock of Victorian corsets. But instead, people willingly hand over half a paycheck to feel like they're blow-drying their hair with the future. Because sometimes, style is worth the splurge, especially when it comes with a heat-protective diffuser and a 4-year warranty. Still, not everyone's on board the high-tech hype train. Some people remain loyal to the classics, the drugstore dryer that's slightly cracked but dependable, the wall-mounted hotel model that wheezes out lukewarm air, or even the humble box fan that doubles as hair tool and white noise machine. Yet, here we are. From fireplace flickers to precision airflow, from gas pipe monstrosities to devices that might actually understand quantum mechanics, the hairdryer has gone from medieval nightmare to modern miracle. It dries, it styles, it whispers sweet nothings while protecting your cuticle layer. In short, it blows but fashionably.